Robb Stark gazed across the torchlit hall of Riverrun, hearing the murmur of his gathered bannermen while the river winds pressed faintly against the walls. The air in the great hall felt taut with rumor and expectation, that low-thrumming tension that always preceded fateful decisions. By rights, after his father's death and the raging conflict on every side, Robb should have been weary to his very bones. The weight on his shoulders had grown heavier than he'd ever imagined as a boy in Winterfell. But he was a Stark of the North, and his father had taught him that weariness was no excuse for inaction. A leader must bear the burdens of his people. So he walked with squared shoulders beneath the banner of the direwolf, returning the respectful but urgent gazes of the men who had named him king in the north. He stopped where the polished oak dais rose above the rest of the hall. Riverlords, Northmen, all loyal to House Stark, or at least in alliance with it for the time being, had assembled on the benches below. The same restless hush lay over them, like a field of tall grass swaying in an uncertain breeze. Though the banners of Tully, Manderley, Reed, Umber, and others rose about him, all eyes were drawn to the sigil of House Greyjoy that fluttered near the dais. It felt strange, that Kraken banner in the midst of the dire wolf and trout, but Robb did not flinch from it. He forced his mind to consider all that had brought him to this improbable threshold. Balon Greyjoy's rebellion, once a distant memory, was now overshadowed by the War of the Five Kings. Robb's own war had begun in earnest once the Lannisters executed his father. He had marched south, called the banners, and severed ties with the Iron Throne. But in this new age of chaos, alliances changed by the day. The Ironborn had done something half-expected and half-mad, launching raids along the northern coast and seizing Deepwood Motte for their own. They had threatened to push further inland in a bold ambition to secure an ever-larger foothold. But the north was not easy to subdue, nor had the Ironborn expected the savage solidarity of the northern lords who rallied behind Robb. Storms of steel hammered the Ironborn at Deepwood Motte, though it had cost the North blood and heartbreak. Asha Greyjoy had held the stronghold for her father, and her fierce rearguard action had impressed Robb's generals. She fought with a man's boldness, said the rumors, and led her raiders as if she were born to command a fleet and an army alike. She did not yield easily. Rather than face total decimation, though, Asha had accepted parley with the king in the north. And if that parley resulted in something wholly unexpected, like the thought of wedding vows, only the gods knew how one step had led to the next. He remembered the day they spoke under a temporary banner of peace in a battered hall that smelled of sour ale and spilled blood. The light had been grim, the skies above a roiling iron gray, as if the storms of the north and the Iron Islands had merged in some cosmic omen. Asha was flanked by dour-faced Ironborn with salt-stained beards and axes in their belts. She had stepped forward without fear, meeting Robb's eyes with the directness of a woman who believed in her own strength. Her conversation carried the tang of Iron Island's grit, and yet it contained a sharper intelligence than many would have credited an Ironborn raider. Something in that negotiation had sparked a glimmer of mutual respect. They had parted, each to consult with their war councils. And as days bled into weeks, as raiders tested the coasts, as the Northmen struck back fiercely, it became evident that the Greyjoy cause was not a monolith. Asha's father craved his own power, but the Iron Islands were precarious, divided. Some captains wanted to see the main force in the south picking Lannister shipping off the coasts of the Westerlands or sacking their supply lines. Others wanted to ravage the Reach. And Asha, by all accounts, saw what many did not, that in this time of fracturing alliances, a formal pact with the king in the north could give the Iron Islands an opportunity to carve a place in the new order, one not wholly at odds with that of the north. So an idea had brewed in the minds of more cunning strategists, a marriage. A union of the north and the Iron Islands that might forever change the map of Westeros. Of course, Robb had never expected his entire impetus for war to shift around the possibility of wedding an Ironborn woman. He had once been betrothed to a daughter of Walder Frey in a vow made by his mother's urging. That vow had served to secure passage across the Twins. Yet the situation had grown complicated. Circumstances had changed in ways the old man Walder Frey likely had not predicted. And in war, there were always new bargains. At length, through the discussions and the counsel of the great John Umber, the Blackfish Brynden Tully, and his mother Catelyn, a new alliance was struck. The North had hammered a vow of fealty from the Ironborn, but one that allowed them relative autonomy under a single cause, to see Robb remain as king in the North and for the Greyjoys to rule the seas unopposed under his banner. An outlandish proposition, except that it might allow the North to fully concentrate on the Lannisters while the Ironborn harried them at sea. No illusions existed about the difficulty of forging trust between these peoples, but necessity had a way of forging strange steel. Now in the great hall, the watchers whispered among themselves as Balon Greyjoy stood to one side in sullen authority, his thick gray hair wild around his head, his face like granite. He had come to bless this new arrangement in person, flanked by no fewer than 10 salt lords from Pike and beyond. But the true figure of interest tonight was Asha Greyjoy, a woman of slender but wiry build. Her dark hair was cut to her shoulders, her stance as sure-footed as any man's. She wore clothes in the style of the Ironborn, but for this ceremony, a small attempt at compromise showed in a subtle northern cloak that draped her shoulders. She bore the Kraken sigil across her chest, the direwolf ring on her hand. She had not let a single aspect of her own identity slip away. Robb nodded solemnly to her across the dais. She met his gaze without flinching, a slight quirk at the corner of her mouth acknowledging the improbable nature of their union. They had fought on opposite sides not long ago. Now they were to tie their fates, their peoples, in a vow that might change the fortunes of the North and the Iron Islands both. When Catelyn Stark stepped forward to bless her son, there was pride in her eyes but also concern. Catelyn was a Tully by birth. She had grown up here in Riverrun. She knew that alliances in wartime needed to be stronger than mere convenience, else they might shatter at the first sign of adversity. But she also knew the cost of this war, and if the Iron Fleet could be turned against the Lannisters, that might be a difference that saved thousands of northern lives. So she bowed her head, offered a mother's blessings, and tried not to let the complicated swirl of grief and memory for Ned fill her eyes with tears. The ceremony was brief, for the North preferred austerity. The priests of the old gods had come south at Robb's request, though the weirwoods were far to the north. For the Ironborn, a drowned man was in attendance, scowling at the oath but acknowledging it in the name of the drowned god. The old traditions had to bend if the union was to hold. The words were said, plain and clear, as Robb promised to protect Asha, to honor the Ironborn as part of his realm, and as Asha in turn promised her loyalty to the king in the north, so long as the Ironborn's freedom was respected. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the Tully's rivers, blending with the taste of salt so often associated with the Kraken banners. When their hands joined, it was not with the delicate gentleness of a soft courtship. They clasped each other's wrists with a fierceness that caused some watchers to shift in their seats, uncertain of whether to cheer or stand in silent awe. The king in the north, newly wedded, stood as tall as he ever had, mindful of the new path he had set for himself, for his people. Asha Greyjoy, newly a wife, looked out upon the gathered crowd with a defiant tilt to her chin, as though daring them to question her place. When at last they sealed the union with a kiss, it was a brisk, awkward brush of lips, but it carried weight enough that the hall erupted in hoots and calls from the Northmen, and the Ironborn hammered the butts of their axes against the stone floor. A moment later, Great John Umber led a raucous cheer, and to Robb's mild surprise, Asha let a half-grin twist her mouth. A grin that said she did not mind the spectacle as much as she might pretend. Thus began what the minstrels would later call the Storm and Salt Wedding, or the Kraken and the Direwolf's vow. The feast that followed was neither lavish nor meager, but it carried a certain tension behind the many toasts. Northmen glared across trenches of roasted boar at Ironborn, while Ironborn pounded tankards of ale and smacked greasy hands on the table in half-friendly, half-ominous gestures. The music was overshadowed by pointed stares and uneasy alliances. Yet if there were common ground, it lay in the shared delight in strong drink, battle tales, and the sense that all of them were forging a future that might deliver a lethal blow to the Lannisters. Robb watched Asha as she moved through the throng, exchanging curt greetings with Northmen and brash jests with her own Iron captains. She seemed at times more soldier than lady, but that was not a slight. He had never needed a softly smiling lady in the midst of war. He needed an ally who understood the costs and could aid him in delivering victory. And from the glimpses of steel in her eyes, he saw a woman who refused to be overshadowed. She would not bow to him in the southern fashion. But perhaps that was all right. The northern ways did not demand meek courtesy. They demanded loyalty, strength, a certain unyielding spirit. Later, once the last stragglers had drunk themselves into stupors or slunk away, Robb and Asha found themselves alone in a borrowed solar. The bride wore no shy blush. She regarded Robb with a frank curiosity as he poured 2 cups of wine. They each understood that duty and expedience were part of this bargain, but there was some intangible flicker in the air, a spark of mutual respect. She sipped her wine and leaned against a solid chest of drawers. "You're younger than I expected," she said softly. her voice carrying a rasp that might have come from years of shouting commands against the sea wind. "Yet you wear that crown as if you were born with it." "I was not," Robb answered. "But I've learned quickly. I've had to." They spoke in low tones, acknowledging each other's struggles. She told him about fending off rivals among her father's iron captains, men who doubted that a woman could lead. He told her how difficult it was to rally the entire North in the wake of Ned Stark's death, how the other kings pressed in from all directions, and how the Lannisters threatened to devour them all. At one point, Asha looked at him with a wry twist of her lips. "Well, husband, I'd say we're both gamblers, but perhaps we're not so different. My father might not like giving away his daughter to the wolf, but he sees sense in the arrangement. And you?" She trailed off, her eyes flicking over his face. "You're a man who knows the worth of the sea, I suspect." Robb nodded. "If we are to break the might of the Lannisters, we need ships. We need to control the seas. An alliance with House Greyjoy and your leadership of the Iron Fleet gives us a chance to choke off their supplies, raid their coastlines, force their armies to starve. Especially if the Tyrells remain at King's Landing, the Reach might be a foe we cannot face on open fields, so the sea is crucial. That is your domain, and you have the cunning for it." Her chuckle was low. "I like hearing that. My father has his own ways, but I've always believed we should be more than just reavers. Now, if we can do that and also line our chests with Lannister gold, maybe the Iron Islands won't complain too much." He inclined his head. "It will not be easy. The North despises raiders from the sea. The memory of your father's rebellion still lingers. But times change, and for the sake of freedom from the Iron Throne, I think the North will learn to accept an ally with saltwater in her veins. I will make them accept it." Something burned in her gaze, not quite affection, but not contempt. "I told you once when we parleyed, if you want me and my men to bow to you as a king, you had best prove yourself worthy. Perhaps you have." He drank the last of his wine, feeling its warmth settle in his gut. He knew that his bedchamber lay beyond the door. He knew that their marriage was expected to be consummated, witnessed in the old tradition by a few chosen watchers if the Ironborn insisted. But apparently Asha had no interest in that archaic show. She set her cup aside, grabbed him by the collar of his cloak, and whispered in his ear, "Let's see if the king in the North can handle a woman of salt and iron, shall we?" No meek maiden's game, indeed. Robb let himself be pulled toward that next threshold, the last moment of awkward hesitation overshadowed by the knowledge that this was the alliance. This was the vow? In the morning, their union would be sealed not just by words, but by deed, and the rest of Westeros would learn, soon enough, that the wolf and the kraken had become one. In the days that followed, an uneasy camaraderie settled upon Riverrun. The newly forged alliance demanded strategies that consumed Robb's time, leading to long councils in the same battered war room where they had once planned how to cross the Twins or outmaneuver the Lannisters. Now Asha stood at the table with them, her fingers tracing coastlines on the map, her bright eyes scanning shipping lanes, while Roose Bolton watched her with a measuring glance and the Blackfish quietly offered his insights. Catelyn Stark had departed for the Twins, accompanied by a group of negotiators. They would try to soothe Walder Frey's pride over Robb breaking the original betrothal arrangement. A part of Robb's heart clenched in worry each time he thought of it. Breaking faith with Walder Frey was not something one did lightly. But there was no other way. The old man had demanded immediate marriages, immediate ties to the Freys, and that was an impossibility given the greater need. By wedding Asha, Robb risked the Freys' wrath. But if the Iron Fleet truly joined with him, would the Freys dare break from the king in the north? Or, at least, was it a lesser evil than losing the coastline to raiders? "Your mother will keep Walder Frey from turning on us," Asha commented, her tone skeptical but not wholly dismissive. "Or she'll kill him, if we're lucky." Robb cracked a small smile. "If he tries something rash, perhaps I'll wish she had. But no, we need the Freys for a time. Their crossing is vital." He sighed, studying the map. "We press the advantage by sea. That's the point of this alliance." Asha snorted lightly. "My father's men can raid as far as Lannisport. We can disrupt the flow of food from the Reach if we coordinate with your bannermen. The problem is the Ironborn's love of plunder might overshadow the bigger objective. I'll have to keep them in line." The Greyjoy was there, all bristling beard and large grin. He slapped his hand on the table. "If the Ironborn want plunder, let them have it, so long as we drown the Lannisters in their own gold. I say, give them free rein. Let them tear the Lannisters' coastal towns apart." Asha's face grew serious. "We mustn't get too drunk on the idea of easy raiding. The The Lannisters will respond with their fleet, and if we are not careful, we'll be pinned against the rocky coasts. I know the waters near the Westerlands well enough, and my men know them better, but the sea is no gentle friend. Strategy, not just brute force, is how we win." That remark earned her grudging nods from some of the counselors. She stood side by side with Robb, and though he was king, the others found it difficult to ignore the authority she exuded. It wasn't the practiced courtesy or simpering cunning of a southern lady. It was simply the presence of a commander who knew her domain. Even Roose Bolton, cold-eyed as ever, seemed more intrigued than dismissive of her. Soon, word spread that the Union was real, that the Greyjoys were no longer an immediate threat to the north but instead an ally. The outlying lords in the northern territories responded with a mixture of relief and suspicion. Relief because they no longer had to fear further Ironborn attacks. Suspicion because to many, the Ironborn were reavers, oathbreakers, scum. But the king in the north had spoken, and for now, that was that. Balon Greyjoy did not linger long in Riverrun. He departed with much of his retinue, leaving Asha behind to serve as a liaison or perhaps to ensure she was truly bound to the Stark cause. Before he left, the old Kraken gave his daughter a nod that might have been respect or might have been simple acknowledgement of duty. He gave Robb a curt look as if to say, "This had best be worth my time." Then he rode off and would eventually board the Iron Fleet to return to Pike. In the hush Balon left behind, war planning took precedence. The north was vast, but Robb planned to strike quickly into the Westerlands before Tywin could muster all his forces. Asha insisted that a portion of the Iron Fleet coordinate with the Tully ships along the coast. Their combined navy might not be as large as the Redwyne fleet from the Arbor, but it could still wreak havoc if used with cunning. So the gears of war turned. Messengers were dispatched, ravens sent winging to the far corners of the north and beyond. On a brisk morning when the sky was the color of slate, Robb and Asha left Riverrun on horseback, heading for the northern coast where the Greyjoy longships awaited. Accompanying them was a contingent of Northmen, the Blackfish, Brynden Tully, and a smattering of Ironborn who had chosen to ride with their commander. The day's ride was long and cold, and conversation was sparse. Even with his cloak, Robb felt the chill bite at him. But the closeness of Asha by his side was strangely reassuring. Sometimes, in the quiet, he thought of his father. Ned Stark would have guided him with calm wisdom. Would Ned have approved of this alliance? Perhaps if it served the greater good. Ned had always believed in protecting his people above all else. And though Ned had fought the Ironborn in the past, he would have recognized the necessity of forging alliances in desperate times. The ocean smell came to them before they saw it, that briny tang that triggered a watchfulness in the Northmen. For so long, the sea to the west had been a place of dread from which Ironborn reavers might emerge without warning. Now, ironically, those reavers were allies. They crested a ridge that overlooked a small harbor once used for Riverlands trading. It was not large, but enough to shelter a portion of the Iron Fleet. The black masts and sleek hulls were arrayed like a swarm of eels. Banners of the Kraken fluttered in the breeze, and upon seeing their approach, men on the decks let out a raucous cry. Asha urged her horse forward, turning in her saddle to call to Robb, "Let's see how the wolves fare at sea." He gave a short nod, dismounting alongside the Blackfish. The Tully sworn knights took the lead, greeting the local garrison that had been left to guard the harbor. The Ironborn were restless and impatient, likely wanting to set sail. Robb walked down to the docks, observing the ships. They were built for speed and raiding, with lines that promised agility. Their captains and crews eyed the newcomers with expressions ranging from scorn to grudging acceptance. But when Asha dismounted and strode among them, they saluted her with fists to their chests. She was their commander, or near enough. Brynden Tully paused at Robb's side. Her men seemed to hold her in high regard. "That's worth something." "Yes," Robb said quietly. "If the Lannisters underestimate her, all the better for us." Soon, they boarded the largest of the iron ships, the Black Wind, which had been Asha's command. It carried a fearsome prow carved like a kraken's head, the paint chipped and scarred from endless battles at sea. Asha guided Robb onto the deck. She barked orders to the mates, who in turn responded with crisp efficiency. Robb had been on ships before, but always in White Harbor's more stately vessels, never on an Ironborn raider. The difference was striking. The Black Wind felt alive beneath his feet, as though the sea's pulse fed directly into its timbers. Asha led him to the helm, where the wind whipped her hair back. "Shall we get underway, my lord husband?" she said with mock courtliness. He couldn't help a small laugh. "Aye, let's." The Blackfish and a handful of other Northmen boarded smaller ships to accompany them. Sails were hoisted and ropes were loosened. With a shudder and creak, the Iron Fleet slid away from the docks, the brine-laced wind filling the sails. Robb felt the roll of the deck underfoot and a subtle exhilaration chased away the chill in his bones. This was the Alliance in action, the king in the north commanding by land while the Ironborn commanded the waves. If they could use the fleet to isolate Lannisport to sever the Lannisters' supply lines, victory might be within reach. They sailed along the coastline, making for the mouth of the Tumblestone, near which some Tully war galleys had assembled. The plan was to combine forces and sail for Fair Isle, a strategic point that guarded the approach to Lannisport. If the Allied fleet could hold Fair Isle, the Lannisters' shipping would be crippled and any chance to bring in food from the Reach would be delayed or destroyed. Meanwhile, Robb's land forces would invade the Westerlands from the northeast. Asha stood at the prow, scanning the horizon. Robb joined her, leaning on the railing. Below them, the water slapped the sides of the hull with a brisk cadence. "Ever sailed this far south before?" he asked, tucking a stray curl behind his ear. "Once," she said. "When I was younger, a reaving expedition that took us down the coast of the Westerlands. We raided Lannister fishing villages, but never had the men to hold any territory. My father wanted silver and spoils, not land. That's always been the Ironborn way, take, then vanish with the tide." But now she shrugged. "Now we're playing a different game. We're not just reaving, we're shaping the future of the North and the Iron Islands both." Robb studied her profile. There was a harshness to Asha's features that was distinctly Ironborn, but there was also a quiet determination. He thought of the many noble ladies he'd encountered at court in the south, how they conversed with sweet words and hidden daggers. Asha was neither sweet nor particularly subtle. She was a dagger in plain sight. But that was something he could respect in war if not in the delicate politics of the realm. As the day wore on and the coast slid by in a pattern of rocky cliffs and narrow beaches, the two of them spoke quietly about their families. Asha asked him of Bran, Rickon, and the sisters. Robb admitted that Sansa was still, to his knowledge, in King's Landing as a hostage of the Lannisters, while Arya's whereabouts remained unknown. A dark sorrow underlined those words. He looked out at the waves and wondered if each day he did not move forward in this war, was he failing them somehow? Asha listened, her expression not exactly soft, but she placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "We'll do what must be done," she said. "The Lannisters will pay for every wrong. This war is as much about retribution as it is about politics. That's something the Ironborn understand." He nodded. "Yes. We'll make them pay and we'll free my sisters." Below decks, the Ironborn crew busied themselves. Some cast sideways glances at the young king in the north, but none dared speak against him. The respect they bore for Asha seemed to extend to him now. Robb, in turn, made an effort to learn some of their names to show them he was not an aloof mainlander. He even asked about the workings of the ship, the intricacies of sailing. He discovered that while the Ironborn had a fierce reputation, they also held a deep pride in their seamanship, as if the waves and storms themselves had tested them from birth. That night, the fleet anchored near a sheltered bay. Robb found that sleeping aboard the Black Wind was an exercise in adjusting to the constant motion. But he managed, lulled by the knowledge that for once the sea was no longer his foe. He woke before dawn to the sound of gulls crying. He made his way on deck, saw the thin line of pale light in the east, and realized that somewhere, across those hills, the Lannisters' armies might be stirring. Soon, all of them would converge in a storm of swords and blood. When Asha emerged from below decks, she joined him without a word. Together, they watched the sun breach the horizon, and in that silent moment, they seemed less strangers thrown together by war and more two individuals who understood that fate had changed their lives in ways they couldn't have imagined months ago. Within days, they reached the mouth of the Tumblestone, where a cluster of Tully war galleys, smaller but stanch, waited under the command of Edmure Tully and a seasoned master-at-arms. The Tullis eyed the Ironborn ships warily, but when they saw Robb's dire wolf banner, they signaled them in. A brief conference on the deck of one of the Tully galleys solidified the plan. They would sail in unison for Fair Isle, aim to seize the harbor, and hold the Lannisters at bay. The crossing was not without tension. The Ironborn easily chafed at having to coordinate with Greenlanders. But Asha's leadership held them in check, and Robb's presence kept the Tully men from rebuking the Ironborn's cockiness. Their alliance might be fragile, but necessity bound them. Word arrived by Raven that Tywin Lannister was on the move, heading west from Harrenhal. The king's forces would need to be swift. In the days that followed, the combined fleet finally rounded the southwestern tip of the Westerlands, approaching Fair Isle from the sea. It was a bold move, for the Lannisters had fortifications there, and the waters could be treacherous. But if they succeeded, Lannisport itself would be vulnerable. Robb stood at the helm beside Asha as the Iron Fleet advanced, black sails stark against the sky. The Tully galleys formed a second line. They had not expected heavy resistance here, only a handful of Lannister ships that patrolled the waters, plus whatever small garrison held the island. But as they neared the main harbor, they spotted red sails on the horizon. A Lannister squadron, perhaps? Swords were readied, archers prepared their bows, and the tension on deck mounted until it hummed like a drawn bowstring. Asha gave a short, sharp laugh. "It seems we'll have a chance to test our vow, husband." "I never wanted war," Robb said quietly. "But now that it's upon us, let us show them what the North and the Iron Islands can do." She nodded and bellowed to her crew in the harsh Ironborn accent, "Raise the Kraken. Show them we do not fear their lions." At once, the black and gold banners unfurled from the mast, and the men took up their oars to increase speed. The Tully ships, with their trout sigils, spread out to form a line that would protect the rear guard. The Iron Fleet advanced in a wedge formation aimed straight at the Lannister squadron. Robb saw the glint of steel from the enemy ships and the swirl of activity as the Lannisters prepared. Moments before the clash, Asha turned the helm and gave the order to unleash a volley of arrow fire. Arrows whistled through the air, arcing toward the deck of a Lannister galley. Men cried out. The Ironborn, trained in boarding actions, roared as they surged forward. Robb, though less experienced in naval battles, felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. His sword hung at his belt, but he kept out of the way of the frantic sailors. The crash of hulls against hulls resounded across the water. Grappling hooks flew, lines were thrown, and the black wind jerked as it latched onto a Lannister vessel. Ironborn rushed across the gap, howling war cries. Robb joined the boarders, brandishing his sword. The deck of the Lannister ship was a chaos of men, steel, and blood. The reek of salt mingled with the copper tang of spilled lifeblood. Lannister archers loosed arrows at near point-blank range, while Ironborn axemen hacked and shoved. Robb found himself parrying a furious slash from a Lannister officer, the clash of metal ringing in his ears. He forced the man's blade aside and drove his sword home, feeling a grim finality as the officer crumpled. Nearby, Asha fought with two knives, quick and ruthless as she danced across the slippery planks, carving down foes with savage efficiency. The deck pitched beneath them, and for an instant, Robb caught a glimpse of the horizon. Other ships locked in desperate struggle, Tully galleys launching rams, Ironborn reavers swarming over the sides of Lannister carracks. The sea churned, stained in places with drifting bodies. War's brutality was no kinder at sea than on land. But the Ironborn had momentum. The Lannister squadron, caught off guard, could not hold. One by one, the red-sailed ships were boarded, captured, or set ablaze. Smoke curled into the sky. Cheers rose from the Ironborn as they seized the spoils. By midday, the harbor of Fair Isle was within reach, its meager fortification outmatched by the assault. Tully archers rained arrows on the battlements, and the Ironborn scaled the walls. Robb directed the Tully and Northern fighters with as much clarity as he could, ensuring minimal losses. By nightfall, the Allied force held the harbor and the small keep that defended it. Fair Isle had fallen, and with it a crucial vantage point over the sea lanes leading to Lannisport. After the battle, a subdued sort of elation settled over the fleet. They had achieved their objective. The Lannister presence on Fair Isle had been driven out or exterminated. The local populace was left trembling at the new overlords, Starks and Greyjoys, but no mass slaughter took place. Robb had demanded the men respect the local smallfolk. Even Asha, with her reaver instincts, saw the wisdom in not alienating potential new subjects. They needed to hold the island, not drive it into rebellion. In the keep's great hall, newly claimed by the Alliance, Robb and Asha met with the Blackfish and the other captains. Plans were made to blockade Lannisport next, to send outriders to gather intelligence on Tywin's troop movements. If the blockade held, the Lannisters would find themselves cornered, starved of supplies. The men toasted their success. But Robb felt no unbridled joy as he sat at the high table that night. Yes, they had won a victory, but the war was far from over. He sipped from a cup of watered wine, remembering the grim faces of the men who had died that day, both Ironborn and Northmen. This alliance had a price in blood. He wondered if the cost would one day weigh too heavily. Asha joined him, leaning against the table. She still wore her armor, dented and stained, and an air of battle clung to her. "Your men fought well," she said. "Not many kings would board an enemy ship themselves." "I cannot ask my men to risk what I will not risk," Robb said simply. "If I die in battle, at least it will be as a Stark should." Her expression was unreadable for a moment, then she gave a low chuckle. "Well, you fought like a good raider today. Perhaps the drowned god won't be too offended that you hold to your old gods." He found a rueful smile. "Perhaps not." That night, the victors took what rest they could. The keep's spare chambers were quickly claimed. Robb and Asha retired to an upper room once held by the local lord's family. The bed was small but serviceable. They removed their armor in near silence, each lost in thoughts of what came next. But before the final hush of night settled over them, Asha brushed a lock of hair from Robb's forehead. Did I ever think I'd share a bed with the king in the north, on Fair Isle of all places, after defeating Lannisters by sea? No. But the gods, both drowned and old, play strange games. Robb caught her hand gently. Whatever comes, we must see it through. For our peoples. And for the chance to shape a future free from Lannister rule. She nodded, and under the flickering candlelight they shared a moment that felt almost like understanding. Their union was forged by necessity, but perhaps there was more to it now than that first day. Over the next weeks, the blockade of Lannisport began in earnest. A portion of the Iron Fleet, under Asha's command, patrolled the waters, raiding any Lannister or Westerlands vessels that tried to approach. Tully ships helped secure the supply lines back to Riverrun. Word reached them that Tywin Lannister, enraged by this threat to his seat of power, had turned west with a sizable army. If that army reached the coast, it might attempt to lift the blockade from land. Meanwhile, smaller forces of Northmen, guided by Robb's generals, harried Lannister outriders in the Westerlands, drawing them off. In a stroke of cunning, Asha proposed that small groups of Ironborn reavers sail further south, making feints toward the Arbor or the Reach to keep the Tyrell fleet on edge. This would force the Lannisters and Tyrells to keep their ships close to home waters, unable to reinforce Lannisport in full. Robb sanctioned the plan, and soon the far seas were alive with rumors of Ironborn raids. Some of it was exaggerated, some true, all sowing chaos among their enemies. As the days dragged on, ravens brought news of Catelyn Stark's negotiations with Walder Frey. They had not gone smoothly. Walder Frey, incensed by the broken betrothal, threatened to close the twins to northern troops. But Catelyn managed to invoke old oaths, reminding him that the war effort against the Lannisters was still paramount. So for the moment, they had precarious passage, though the Freys demanded certain concessions. Robb, upon reading the missives, felt a spike of frustration. But he could not let the Freys sabotage his efforts. If Walder Frey chose to betray him outright, that might be a separate war to fight. Asha listened to his concerns and shrugged. The Freys are useless on the sea. If they side against us, well, the next time they try to move goods by ship, we'll see to it they lose more than a few barges. Her confidence in naval power was unwavering. Robb's northern lords, including the Great John, the Manderleys, the Glovers, and others, seemed grudgingly impressed by the alliance's gains. If they could starve the Lannisters and break their hold, the road to a free north would be open. But still, the tension between the Northmen and the Ironborn simmered. Glances that spoke of old wounds, occasional brawls in the camp. Asha and Robb had to quash several disputes. Late one evening, Robb convened a war council in the keep on Fair Isle. A dozen highborn men and women gathered around the table, northern generals, Tully officers, Ironborn captains. A map of the Westerlands lay before them, weighted at the corners with stones. Candles flickered, casting long shadows. Robb traced a line from Fair Isle to Lannisport. If we can take or at least besiege Lannisport, Tywin's seat of power will be threatened directly. Casterly Rock might still stand as their seat, but the wealth of Lannisport is crucial. The Blackfish nodded. We'd need to coordinate a land assault with the blockade. Siege engines, perhaps? But the city's walls are strong. Asha leaned forward, pointing to an inlet on the map. There's a cove here, just south of Lannisport, that could be used to land troops if we're subtle. The city's main gates face inland. If we strike from the sea at the same time your host attacks from the north, the Lannisters might be overwhelmed. Great John Umber grinned fiercely. I like the sound of that. Hit 'em hard from two directions. Make the lions squeal. Roose Bolton, silent until now, spoke with his soft, unsettling voice. We must be mindful of Tywin's approach. He is no fool. If he arrives in time, we may find ourselves caught between the Lannister forces on land and the city's defenses by sea. Robb acknowledged the warning. Then we must time it carefully. My scouts suggest Tywin's main host is still days away from Lannisport. We have that window. If we fail, we risk great losses. If we succeed, the war may turn decisively in our favor. The men and women exchanged glances. The risk was immense, but in war, fortune favored the bold. That night, the plan was set. Troops would land south of Lannisport under cover of darkness, assisted by the Iron Fleet. Meanwhile, Robb's northern cavalry and infantry, gathered in the hinterlands of the Westerlands, would press toward the city from the north. The Tully ships would remain at Fair Isle to guard against any naval relief. 3 days later, the plan was put into motion. Asha commanded a portion of the Iron Fleet, while Robb led the main army on land. The nights were short, the tension thick, and communications had to be swift. Ravens flew, riders galloped, signals were devised to coordinate the two forces. If all went well, they would converge on Lannisport at dawn on the chosen day. Robb's ride through the Westerlands was fraught with minor skirmishes. Lannister scouts harried them and small forces launched hit-and-run attacks. But the Northern Army held its discipline, forging onward through gold-hued fields and rolling hills. The men were weary from campaigning, but the prospect of capturing Lannisport drove them forward. Meanwhile, the Iron Fleet sailed under the cloak of night, hugging the rocky coast to evade detection. On the eve of the assault, Robb's army made camp a few miles north of Lannisport. Fires were kept low, and scouts reported that the city was not fully garrisoned. Many of Tywin's best troops had marched with him eastward. Still, the walls were manned and a smaller Lannister force guarded the gates. Robb's heart pounded as he thought of the dawn attack. He prayed to the old gods for success, for the safety of his men, for vengeance on the Lannisters who had shattered his family. And he found himself thinking of Asha at sea, hoping the tides favored her approach. Dawn came in a wash of pale light that gilded the city's walls. Robb's horns and drums signaled the march. The Northmen and Riverlanders advanced in loose formation, intending to feign a larger presence and draw the defenders' attention to the land gates. Lannister horns sounded in reply. Archers on the walls unleashed volleys, and the assault began. At the same time, out at sea, a dark cluster of Ironborn ships glided into the cove. Asha, standing on the prow of the Black Wind, directed the landing craft. Longboats filled with Ironborn raiders, each with axes and swords at the ready, rowed ashore. On the beach, they formed ranks and began making their way toward the southern side of Lannisport. If the defenders had devoted most of their forces to the northern gates, they would be ill-prepared for an attack from the rear. Sure enough, the city's walls were not as heavily manned on the southern side. The Ironborn brought up rope ladders and siege hooks, scaling sections of the walls with brutal efficiency. The defenders who rushed to meet them found themselves overwhelmed by the savage assault. Soon, gates were forced open from the inside, just as Robb's men battered the northern gates. The clangor of battle echoed in the streets as the two forces converged. Robb, leading a vanguard of mounted men, crashed through the battered gate and into the city's outskirts. Townsfolk fled in terror or cowered in their homes. Lannister guards attempted to form defensive lines, but the pincer movement from north and south left them reeling. Smoke drifted from sections of the walls where the Ironborn had set small fires. The tang of blood hung in the air. In the cramped streets, Robb dismounted and led his men on foot, pushing toward the city's center. He glimpsed the banner of the Kraken ahead, saw Ironborn dragging a Lannister captain into the street. Then he saw Asha, her helm tossed aside, brandishing a sword in one hand and a throwing axe in the other. She spotted him amid the chaos, and a wild grin split her face. They fought side by side through a knot of Lannister soldiers, steel meeting steel in a cacophony of shrieks. The Lannisters, for all their might, were caught off guard. Once the city was partially in Allied hands, pockets of resistance collapsed. Robb ordered his men to secure the main thoroughfares, preventing further bloodshed against civilians. Asha roared at her Ironborn to contain their pillaging. Some was inevitable, but a measure of restraint could help them hold the city. By midday, Lannisport was theirs. Messengers scoured the streets, demanding the people lay down arms. Any Lannister soldiers who wished to surrender were corralled in a makeshift pen under guard. The city's port, the lifeblood of Lannisport, was now swarming with Ironborn ships. Robb and Asha met at the steps of the main citadel, where the local garrison had finally yielded. Their armor was splattered with blood, their expressions grim but triumphant. A hush settled over the battered city. The howling of dying men receded into the distance. Great John Umber arrived, his sword crusted with gore, to announce, "We've taken 1,000 prisoners, maybe more. The locals are subdued. It's done, my king." Robb nodded slowly, turning to Asha. "We hold Lannisport." She wiped sweat from her brow. "And Tywin Lannister's going to come for it." "Yes," Robb said. "But now we have a strong position. If he tries to assault the city, he'll face us on familiar ground, and we can keep supplies moving in by sea. He'll have to starve us out or risk a direct assault." Some of the Northmen began to chant, "The king in the north." The king in the north. Ironborn voices joined, though less reverently, more like a battle cry. The uneasy alliance had seized a major prize. Word would soon spread throughout Westeros. The wolf and the kraken had ripped out the heart of Lannister power on the western coast. That night, Robb stood on the battlements overlooking the harbor. Torches glimmered below, reflected in the dark water. Ships swayed at anchor. The city was quiet, save for the occasional moan of the wounded or the flicker of flames from a still smoldering building. A bitter taste filled his mouth, the taste of victory tempered by the cost. War never spared the innocent. Lannisport's people had lost loved ones today. He reminded himself that the Lannisters had brought this upon themselves with their tyranny and cruelty. Yet a part of him hated the necessity of it. Asha appeared at his side, gazing out at the sea. For a time, neither spoke. Then she rested a hand on the stone crenellation. "We did it. Against the odds, we took Lannisport." He nodded. "Aye. Now we have to keep it." She turned to him, eyes flicking over his face. "You're thinking about what comes next?" "Always." He paused, letting the night air coil between them. "Tywin will come with a large force. Perhaps the Tyrells will join him. Our blockade might be tested by a fleet from the Reach. We can't hold Lannisport against the entire might of the realm forever. But if we can deal a crushing defeat to Tywin here, if we can hold, perhaps that will force the Iron Throne to negotiate, to acknowledge the North's independence and the Iron Islands' autonomy." She listened, her expression pensive. "And if that happens, what then? Do we remain bound in this alliance, a wolf and a kraken side by side?" He exhaled, remembering that their marriage was not just a battlefield tactic. "Yes," he said, voice quiet but certain. "We remain bound. We may not be the fondest of lovers, but we are partners, ruling as equals or as close to equals as our titles allow." She inclined her head. "The Ironborn value freedom, but we also value strength. So long as you and your North can offer that, we'll stand by you. If you waver, or if you try to subjugate us," she let the threat linger. Robb faced her fully, the moonlight etching shadows on their features. "I have no desire to subjugate the Iron Islands. My father never sought to do so, either. We only wanted peace for our people. That might look different now in these times. But I swear on the memory of Ned Stark, I do not seek to crush you." She studied him, and though her features were sharp, her gaze softened slightly. "Then perhaps we have a chance, Wolf. A real chance to change the shape of this realm." Below them, the ships rocked gently, a sign that in the midst of all the bloodshed and ambition, life at sea continued its eternal rhythm. The night carried the faint hush of waves, the promise of storms yet to come. Robb reached for Asha's hand, and she allowed it. Their fingers entwined, scarred from different battles. Both young, yet forced to bear burdens older than themselves. If the rest of Westeros scorned them, if the Freys howled betrayal, if the Lannisters roused every ally, none of that could diminish the significance of the moment. They stood together on the walls of a conquered city, the king in the north and the Ironborn bride who was now queen of salt and snow. And, for a brief, flickering instant, a sense of resolve bound them closer than either had expected. In this new age of war, alliances might shift like sand, but they had carved out a place for themselves with sword and cunning. In the days and weeks that followed, Lannisport bristled with preparations for a siege. Robb oversaw the distribution of rations, the fortification of the gates, the stationing of archers on the walls. Asha inspected the harbor, ensuring the Ironborn ships remained ready to sail at a moment's notice, either to raid further down the coast or to engage any relief fleet. Northmen patrolled the streets, uneasy in the southern city, while Ironborn roamed the docks in search of coin or amusements. Still, discipline held for the most part. A handful of ravens flew in and out. Robb waited anxiously for word from the Riverlands, from Winterfell, from his mother at the Twins. Little news came, except that Tywin's army was nearing the Gold Road. Likely he would reach Lannisport soon. The final confrontation loomed. Meanwhile, more vessels from the Iron Islands arrived, bringing additional reavers. The great forging of a new naval power, North and Iron, was well underway. Twice, small Lannister forces tried to probe the city's defenses, only to be driven back by archers and cavalry sallies. Each minor victory emboldened Robb's troops. But when the main Lannister host appeared on the horizon, dust rising in columns, the real test began. Scouts reported massive numbers, tens of thousands with siege engines. The city readied itself for a grim siege. Robb stood on the battlements again, gazing at the distant banners of House Lannister snapping in the wind. a lion on a crimson field, so different from the white wolf or the golden kraken. Tywin's power was not to be taken lightly. Even with the city walls, the defenders were outnumbered. The presence of the Iron Fleet gave them a strong supply line, but if the Tyrell fleet joined the Lannisters, that advantage could be negated. Asha joined him, her expression solemn. "We hold the city. We have the walls, the harbor. If Tywin tries a direct assault, we'll bleed him." Robb nodded, though he felt a knot in his stomach. "If the Tyrells come by sea, we'll have to fight a two-front battle. Our only chance is to force Tywin to commit, then break his army before the Tyrells arrive. Or pray the Tyrells choose not to come." She flicked her gaze over the horizon. "The Ironborn love a good fight, but we're not used to this kind of war. Holding a city, defending a perimeter. We excel at striking fast and disappearing. I hope your Northmen can make up the difference." "We have no choice," Robb said quietly. "We'll stand or fall together." The siege began in earnest the next day. Tywin's forces surrounded the landward sides of Lannisport, setting up camp beyond bowshot. Siege towers appeared, lines of catapults, all the grim instruments of war. The city's defenders braced themselves. Asha's Ironborn patrolled the harbor, ensuring no one slipped in unseen. Lannister heralds rode to the gates, demanding that the city yield and the so-called king in the north surrender. Robb refused. Thus, the cycle of siege warfare took hold, days of bombardment from catapults, nights of raids and counterattacks. The clang of steel, the thrum of arrows. At times, the city's defenders made sorties, smashing small siege engines before retreating inside. Morale fluctuated. The small folk of Lannisport, caught in the middle, huddled in their homes. Some starved, some died from stray missiles. Robb did what he could to maintain order, distributing rations carefully. Asha ensured the Ironborn did not revert to full-scale pillaging. Weeks passed, or felt like weeks, though time blurred in the haze of war. Robb wore the mantle of leadership heavily. He was not a fool. He knew that if Tywin persisted, the city might fall. Every night, he studied the star-filled sky and prayed for some stroke of fortune. Asha, too, wore herself thin, organizing the fleet, leading nighttime raids against Lannister supply lines. More Ironborn ships arrived, supplementing their strength, but so far, no sign of the Tyrell navy. That might be the only blessing in this attrition. One evening, as the sun bled into the sea, a sentry raced to Robb's command post. Riders approaching from the east, bearing Stark banners. Robb's heart leapt. Reinforcements? Had the rest of the northern host arrived? He rushed to the eastern gate, half expecting to see the great Jon or Roose Bolton or someone else returning with men. Instead, he found his mother, Catelyn Stark, leading a small party. Walder Frey's men were conspicuously absent, but some Tully knights rode with her, along with a tall figure wearing the mailed cloak of a northern lord. The gates opened and Robb embraced Catelyn. She looked exhausted but resolute. "Mother," he said, "you made it through the lines?" She nodded, breathless. "We circled far to the north, slipping past the Lannisters under cover of night. I could not stand idle while you were besieged here. I bring tidings, both good and ill." She glanced behind her, and Robb followed her gaze to the tall man who dismounted. His hair was dark, streaked with silver, his expression cold and stern. He inclined his head to Robb. "You wear your crown well, your grace." Roose Bolton had returned. Robb felt a chill. "I'm surprised to see you, Lord Bolton. I'd have thought you'd remain with your forces in the east." Catelyn grimaced. "I insisted he come. We have a plan, Robb. Walder Frey has withheld most of his forces, but not all. Enough men are at the Twins to keep the crossing. The Freys are more fractious than I knew, and some remain loyal. Bolton proposes a daring maneuver if you will hear it." Robb's instincts told him to be cautious, but he waved them inside the gate. They convened in a half-ruined courtyard where the cinders of a recent catapult strike smoldered. Robb, Asha, Catelyn, and Bolton circled around. Night was falling swiftly. The distant roar of the sea underscored each word. Bolton spoke in his measured tone, "Your Grace, Tywin Lannister does not yet know that we have more forces moving through the Westerlands. If we can lure him into an assault on the city, hold him on the walls, I will strike his rear with fresh troops. The Freys, or at least the segment loyal to your mother's persuasion, have gathered enough men to join me. We have been marching behind Tywin's lines. If we time it right, we can catch him between the city's garrison and our host." Robb's gaze sharpened. "You have a host close by, behind Tywin?" "Yes," Bolton said. "We've moved with discretion. Tywin is aware of potential threats, but not certain. If you give the signal and if the gates open at the right moment to pin his men, I believe we can destroy the Lannister army in one decisive engagement." Catelyn laid a hand on Robb's arm. "It's a risk, my son, but it might be our best chance to end this. If Tywin's army is broken here, the Lannisters cannot hold the Westerlands. King's Landing will be vulnerable from the west. You might force them to acknowledge your independence." Robb looked at Asha. Her lips pressed thin, but she nodded. "If you can break Tywin's army, that means we can keep control of Lannisport. The Ironborn can then drive further along the coast without worrying about a relief force." So it was agreed. The plan hinged on subterfuge. Robb would continue to let the siege grind on, feigning weakening morale. Bolton's hidden host would wait for the moment to strike. Then, when Tywin launched a major assault or was provoked into one, Bolton's men would close the trap. The next day, a raven was dispatched carrying coded instructions to Bolton's second-in-command. Days passed with no major shift until the Lannisters, perhaps sensing the defenders were growing desperate, prepared a grand assault at dawn. Their siege towers rolled forward, catapults lobbed flaming missiles, and lines of armored men advanced. Robb, from the walls, watched them come. The city shook under the barrage, but the defenders held firm, archers loosing arrow after arrow, stone throwers toppling siege ladders. A hush of dread preceded the final moment. Then, on the horizon, horns blared. A second force emerged, banners of House Bolton and the fray swirling. Thousands of fresh troops fell upon the rear of Tywin's lines. The timing was near perfect. Caught between the city walls and Bolton's men, the Lannisters reeled. Confusion reigned. Robb led a sally from the gates, smashing into the disordered lines. Asha's Ironborn joined, leaping off the walls onto unsuspecting men below. Chaos, screams, the clangor of steel. Tywin's proud host threatened to buckle. Yet Tywin himself was a formidable commander. He rallied his bannermen, trying to carve a path out of the encirclement. For a time, it looked as though he might succeed, leading a wedge of knights that battered at Bolton's lines. But the Great John and Catelyn's Tully knights slammed into his flank, while Robb's Northmen pressed from the city. The final blow came when Asha's Ironborn charged from a side street, hacking into the mounted knights with savage fury. Tywin's forces shattered. In the midst of that carnage, Robb glimpsed Tywin Lannister himself, his golden armor splattered with blood, expression carved in stone. Surrounded, outnumbered, the Lord of Casterly Rock refused to yield. Robb saw him fend off two attackers, only to have a spear take his horse in the flank. The beast collapsed, pinning him. More swords rose, and Tywin vanished in a swirl of violence. The battle raged on, but the mainstay of the Lannisters' fighting spirit was lost. By midday, the field was strewn with corpses. Smoke and the stench of death filled the air. Survivors were taken captive in droves. Bolton's host joined with the city's defenders, victory resonating in every shout. Lannisport's gates stood battered but unbroken, the wolf and kraken banners flying above them. The Lannisters' mighty army lay in ruin, Tywin Lannister presumably dead or mortally wounded, though his body was never found for certain. Some said he had been carried away by a loyal guard in the chaos. Others claimed they saw him fall. Regardless, the Lannister command structure was sundered. Standing amidst the wreckage, Robb looked at the cheering Northmen, the Ironborn raising their axes, and realized that the entire shape of the war had changed. King's Landing would learn of this soon, if they hadn't already. The Lannisters had lost their greatest general. Their seat of power in the west was threatened by an alliance no one would have dreamed of, the Wolf King and the Iron Queen. Catelyn, exhausted, approached him. She bore a small wound on her arm, but her eyes were alight with relief. "We've done it," she whispered. Robb embraced her, tears burning behind his eyelids. "Father, if you could only see," he murmured under his breath. Ned Stark might have been horrified by the scale of the slaughter, but he would have understood that sometimes wars had to be won by such means. Not far away, Asha Greyjoy stripped off her helm, letting the wind ruffle her sweat-streaked hair. She and Robb locked gazes across the churned mud. She gave him a sharp nod, respect shining there. And for the first time, Robb felt a surge of something beyond mere respect for his Ironborn bride. This woman had fought beside him, risked everything with him, and now they had achieved a victory that might reshape the realm. In the aftermath, negotiations with the local lords of the Westerlands, motherless without Tywin, began. Some bent the knee to the king in the north or at least declared neutrality. Others fled to join distant relatives or gather behind the walls of Casterly Rock. But with Lannisport and Fair Isle firmly under Stark Greyjoy control, the impetus was on King's Landing to respond. Months of grueling conflict stretched on, but no single force rivaled what Tywin had once commanded. The Ironborn consolidated their hold on the western seas. The Northmen established a strong presence in Lannisport, and the Riverlands stabilized under Tully influence. The combined effect was that the Lannisters' power waned, and the Iron Throne faced the prospect of losing the entire West. Whispers of a negotiated peace grew louder. Some said that if the Tyrells refused to fully commit their fleet, King's Landing might have no choice but to acknowledge the independence of the North. The Greyjoys, for their part, pressed for formal recognition of their dominion over the Iron Islands and certain coastal enclaves. Through it all, Robb and Asha found themselves tested as rulers. Administrative burdens weighed heavily. The North had to be governed, Lannisport repaired, the Ironborn captains appeased, and alliances maintained. But each dawn, they woke to find themselves still bound together, forging a realm that blended the strength of the wolf with the ferocity of the kraken. When a delegation finally arrived from King's Landing, led by emissaries loyal to Queen Cersei and her son Joffrey, Robb received them in the keep at Lannisport, once the seat of Lannister power in the city, now turned into a seat of the king in the north. Asha stood at his side, clad in practical leathers, a dirk at her belt. The delegation quivered at the sight of her. Beside her, the Blackfish and other northern lords watched with stoic expressions. Roose Bolton loomed in the background like a thin shadow, and Catelyn Stark maintained a polite but icy mien. The emissaries spoke of an armistice, a willingness to consider the North's independence if certain conditions were met. The Iron Islands were a thornier issue, for the Crown had never been fond of letting reavers roam free. But Asha made it clear that the Iron Fleet would not submit. If the Crown wanted peace, it would have to grant the Ironborn the right to rule themselves. Days of negotiation ensued, each side testing the other. In the end, an uneasy truce was declared. Joffrey remained king on the Iron Throne, but the Crown recognized Robb Stark as king in the north, with domain over the entire north. The Riverlands pledged to maintain close alliance, and the Iron Islands formally under the rule of House Greyjoy, who in turn acknowledged alliance with the north. The victory had come at terrible cost, but it was a new dawn for the Wolf and Kraken. As Lannisport began its slow recovery under the watchful presence of the Allied forces, Robb walked along the repaired harbor walls one morning, the gulls crying overhead. The sea stretched out in a vast sheet of gray-blue dotted with Ironborn ships. He felt the crisp salt wind on his face, thinking of home. Thinking of how this war had changed him, changed them all. Asha joined him, footsteps echoing on the stone. Without ceremony, she slipped her hand into his. They stood side by side, gazing at the horizon where the sun rose, painting the water in molten light. She squeezed his fingers lightly, a tacit gesture that said more than words. No one could say for certain what trials lay ahead. Winter still threatened the realm, the Game of Thrones in King's Landing was far from ended, and the scars of war ran deep. But for this moment, at least, they had found a way. The North and the Iron Islands, together in naval supremacy, forging a new future from the wreckage of old loyalties. A wolf and a kraken entwined. And so their story truly began. Over the following weeks, Robb Stark recognized that the consequences of their hard-won victory would ripple through the Seven Kingdoms in ways both seen and unseen. Lannisport's tall walls and bustling harbor had become the headquarters of a newly affirmed realm that tied the North and the Iron Islands together in a precarious, if effective, union. Pride and resentment lingered on all sides, and not even the knowledge that the Lannisters had bent to a truce could dissolve the deep suspicions that northern lords harbored toward the Ironborn, and vice versa. Yet necessity bound them. The realm had changed, and with Tywin's defeat, the lions roared no longer on the western shore. Robb found himself pulled in countless directions each day. Meeting with local Westerlands lords who sought to negotiate their obligations, conversing with emissaries from the Riverlands who worried about Walder Frey's fickle loyalties, and handling the endless tasks of repairing war-torn Lannisport itself. The city bore scars from the siege, and though it had not been as thoroughly sacked as some feared, the marks of catapult fire and burning pitch were visible in charred rooftops and scorched timber. Some streets had been torn up in the fighting, and a handful of collapsed buildings still lay in rubble. Yet the harbor teemed with life. Ironborn longships moored side by side with cargo vessels from White Harbor or from across the Sunset Sea, reminding all observers that trade would continue, no matter the color of the banners above. The uneasy part was forging a real government. However reluctant they might have been, local merchants and lesser nobles could not help but see that the king in the north, joined now to the Iron Islands by marriage, held the city with unyielding control. Robb's intention was not to treat Lannisport as conquered territory to be pillaged, but rather as a gateway to the new age he hoped to shape. If the Lannisters could be forced to concede the independence of the North and the autonomy of the Iron Islands, then perhaps Lannisport, at the crossroad of sea trade, might flourish under a freer hand than Tywin's iron grip. Asha Greyjoy was quick to see the possibilities. Lannisport offered coin and commerce on a scale few of the Iron Islands had ever known. Her father Balon had always been more raider than ruler. The old Kraken's sole aim was to seize what he could and let the spoils speak for themselves. But there were Ironborn captains, Asha included, who realized that permanent dominion over strategic ports would bring more wealth in the long run than endless cycles of reaving. If the North was to remain an ally, if the Wolf and the Kraken were truly forging a new axis of power, then Lannisport could become a cornerstone. She confided these thoughts to Robb as they walked one morning among the ashes of a ruined warehouse near the docks, picking their way past blackened beams. Workmen cleared the debris while a grizzled Ironborn overseer barked orders. The sky was sharp and clear, smelling faintly of fish and salt. In the distance, gulls circled overhead, seeking scraps left behind by the morning's catch. "The city's rich, Wolf," Asha said, her tone practical. "Even battered by war, you can see the silver glimmering in the markets. The Lannisters bred a culture of trade and coin. They taxed everything, of course, but gold has a way of clinging to these docks. If we were to keep a presence here, an arrangement that satisfies the locals while ensuring loyalty, we'd have a steady flow of coin for your North and my Iron Islands both. My father may not love the idea of administering anything, but if I stand at the helm, we can keep the Kraken's hold." Robb paused beside a collapsed cart, studying the beams that had once been part of the warehouse ceiling. The odor of burnt fish still hung in the air. "That's the idea," he agreed, thinking aloud. "Keep the city functioning. The war's not over, King's Landing remains under Joffrey's control, the Tyrells might still be dangerous," and the phrase he trailed off, feeling a pang of frustration. "We'll need every advantage if we want to preserve our position once the realm finds its balance. And wealth is an advantage. People respect crowns less than they respect gold." Asha nodded. She looked different in the daylight. Her hair was still cropped short and somewhat wild, her features as hard and sure as any Ironborn man, yet something in her stance had shifted since the earliest days of their alliance. There was an acceptance, or at least a grudging comfort, in how she carried herself as the King in the North's wife. She was no soft lady of the South, and no one in Lannisport dared treat her as such. Each morning, she rose to inspect the docks, exchanging briny banter with captains. She also attended war councils with the Northern Lords, men who never imagined they would share a table with an Ironborn raider. Yet day by day, conflict gave way to uneasy respect. "We should speak plainly, though," Asha added. "The Ironborn will want to make this port their own. If not for you, we'd claim it outright and drown any who resisted. But I'm not fool enough to believe we can maintain that approach forever. Our alliance matters. We must keep the city's inhabitants from rising against us, as well as keep your northern lords from turning their blades on my men the moment they see a ship loaded with spoils." She gazed at him steadily. "You realize how delicate this is?" Robb inclined his head. "I do. I can't let the North see me as weak, handing a Westerland's city to reavers. But I can't let the Ironborn think I'll betray them the first time we disagree. We need a balanced solution. For now, we share authority. Let Lannisport remain under my banner, but you hold strong representation in the harbor. Collect some tariffs, build your presence, but with checks. That might ease the tensions long enough for us to present a united front to the rest of Westeros." She lifted her eyebrows as if mildly impressed. "You're learning the game quickly. The Ironborn are used to simpler methods: kill, take, sail away. But to be a queen, or a ruler of any sort, is more complicated than leading a raid. I'll see that my captains understand. Not all of them will like it, but I can keep order." They spoke a while longer, bridging gaps between two worlds that had seldom met in negotiation. When they parted ways, each had a measure of confidence that their rule, precarious though it might be, would last. Even so, conflicts inevitably arose. One morning, a band of Ironborn was caught roughing up local merchants, demanding tribute. A group of northern soldiers intervened, leading to a tense standoff in a cramped alley. Blades were drawn, blood was spilled. 3 men died, 2 locals and 1 Ironborn, and the rest nursed wounds or fled into the city. Rumors of the clash sparked panic. Some Lannisport families feared that the Ironborn planned a new wave of terror. Others whispered that the Northmen had only intervened to seize the city for themselves, never intending to share power. The tension reached Robb and Asha within the hour. In the high-ceilinged hall of the old Lannisport governor's estate, which now served as a seat of administration, Robb assembled a group of representatives, northern lords, local merchants, and Ironborn captains. Asha stood at his side, the pair of them an unorthodox sight. Sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating the scuffed marble floor and the chipped golden lions carved into the walls. The legacy of House Lannister loomed everywhere in the architecture, but the sense of new authority overshadowed those lion emblems. Greyjoy arrived, sword clanking, face set in a fierce scowl. A tall Ironborn reaver with a scar across one eye stood across from him, fists clenched. The local merchants hovered in the background, pale-faced. Robb raised his hand before anyone could speak. "We won't have more blood spilled over petty disputes," he announced. His voice, though young, carried the authority of a king. "The men responsible for the violence in the alley will face judgment, no matter which side they served. We can't maintain order in the city if every day brings new killings." Greyjoy bristled. "Those iron scum demanded coin from honest tradesmen. Our men stepped in to protect them." "That's the story, my king." The scarred Ironborn spat on the ground. "Your men forced themselves into our business. We were only collecting what's due us by right of conquest. Isn't that what the Ironborn do? Or has the king in the north turned us into simpering handmaidens?" A ripple of tension passed through the hall. Asha's eyes narrowed dangerously. She glanced at Robb, then addressed the Ironborn in a steely voice. "You speak of the old ways, but times have changed. We stand as allies to the king in the north. We don't plunder and terrorize subjects we intend to rule. We had an agreement that Lannisport would be protected from wanton raids. Or did you think that was just talk?" A flush of anger crossed the Reaver's face. "We are Ironborn. We take what is ours. If we wanted to be farmers, we'd live on the mainland. Now we're told to." He never finished. Asha's arm flashed out and she seized him by the collar, yanking him closer with startling strength. "You're told to obey your leaders," she growled. "If you have a quarrel with me, speak it plainly. But don't break the word I've given in these negotiations. It's the only thing keeping our men from tearing each other apart." The Reaver's mouth twitched, torn between anger and grudging respect for the woman who commanded so many Ironborn. Robb, for his part, recognized the precarious moment. One spark could ignite a chain of vendettas. He stepped forward, voice level. "The old ways remain part of who you are, but you chose to stand under my banner when we took the city. You'll get your due, but not by shaking down merchants in the street. We will impose a fair tax, collect it for the city's governance, and see that the Ironborn take a portion for their trouble. But there will be no more extortion. Is that understood?" A hush followed. At length, the Reaver exhaled and nodded stiffly. "Aye, King in the North. We'll do as commanded. But don't expect us to smile about it." "That's enough for me," Robb said. He turned next to the merchants, who stood uncertainly in a small knot. "You'll pay a fair levy, just as you did under the Lannisters. Only now, those coins go to a new authority. If any of my men, be they Northmen or Ironborn, threaten you beyond what is lawful, you'll bring your complaints here, and justice will be done. But you must also make good on your portion. Don't think you can cheat us now that Tywin Lannister is gone." They murmured agreement, a subdued relief in their eyes. Greed and resentment simmered in everyone. No one wanted to part with coin, and no one wanted to see soldiers interfering in commerce. But if the city was to function, some manner of compromise had to hold. Asha released her grip on the Reaver's collar, shoving him back. He stumbled but did not resist. The tension in the hall loosened fractionally. Greyjoy's scowl remained in place, though he turned on his heel and stomped toward the door. For once, he held his tongue. The matter was settled, more or less. After the tense meeting, Robb and Asha conferred privately on an upper balcony overlooking a courtyard that displayed a cracked stone fountain. The statue in the fountain was shaped like a lion's head, chipped and worn. Below them, a cluster of Ironborn sailors loaded barrels of provisions, while further down the lane, a dozen northern archers patrolled. War had hammered the city, but life continued. "You handled it well," Asha said, her voice low so it would not carry. "Some among my people still see negotiation as weakness. But they forget there's more than one way to hold power. I can keep them in line for now." Robb leaned on the rail, glimpsing the partial reflection of the lion statue in the water. It's a precarious balance, but so is ruling. My father often told me that mercy and justice must walk hand in hand. Hard to keep them from stumbling over each other. Asha studied him. Your father had a reputation among the Ironborn, stern, incorruptible. Some hated him for humiliating my father in the rebellion years ago. But Ned Stark was also known for fairness. People said he didn't let cruelty taint him. Robb gave a faint, sad smile. I hope to live up to that. The realm is changing so fast. The War of the Five Kings tore everything apart. We no longer have 5 kings, but we have new struggles. We might even see more players emerging. And then there's the matter of the phrase. He paused, expression darkening. I wonder how long Walder Frey can be appeased with half measures. Sooner or later, he'll want more from me. Asha shook her head dismissively. He's not the only threat. One day, the crown might try to retake the city. And if half the lords in the Westerlands remain loyal to them, we may be fighting on 2 fronts. That's why the Iron Fleet can't simply stand idle. You mean to strike out again? Robb asked. She considered. Maybe not a full campaign, but if the crown tries to rouse House Redwine's fleet or the Tyrell ships from the Reach, the sea lanes could catch fire again. We should keep them guessing. Raids here or there, small enough not to provoke an all-out assault, but enough to keep them worried about exposing their flanks. He did not dismiss the plan, though a tightness coiled in his chest. At some point, the realm must find peace, or we'll bleed ourselves forever. But for now, yes, your strategy might be necessary. They lingered a moment longer, side by side. Her hand brushed lightly against his. He took it, grateful for that fleeting contact. Duty had drawn them together, but in every crisis, they found themselves relying on each other's instincts. As they walked away, the lion's head statue continued to dribble water into the cracked fountain, a silent testament to a vanquished dynasty's influence in a city it could no longer claim. Not 3 days later, a raven arrived from King's Landing. The missive bore the seal of Queen Cersei's regency for King Joffrey. It was couched in polite but firm language, requesting an emissary be sent to discuss the particulars of the truce and hinting strongly that if the terms set forth, namely, recognition of the crown's suzerainty, were not upheld, the crown might call upon the Tyrells or other houses to re-engage. Robb read it in the hush of his private solar with Asha by his side. The letter made his blood boil, for it implied that the North's independence was still conditional, that the Iron Islands were mere pirates who must be leashed. As if they had not spilled enough blood to break free. Does she think we'll kneel now? Asha said, leaning over his shoulder to scan the words. Or is this just a hollow threat? Cersei never lacks cunning, Robb muttered. It's her game, keep us on edge, remind us that the Tyrells have a vast fleet, that there are lords in the Westerlands who might rally if a big enough army marches. She wants to fracture our alliance, sow doubt. Asha folded her arms. If they do call upon the Tyrells, we'll have a tougher fight on the seas. The Reach is said to have formidable ships, and we can't raid them all at once. Robb exhaled. We may need to send an envoy to King's Landing, if only to measure the situation. We don't want open war with the entire realm again. Not while the Freys remain a wild card, and half the Westerlands lords are quietly hedging their bets. But we can't appear weak either. He eyed her sidelong. Would you go? She gave him a flat look. To King's Landing? I'm not sure that's wise. The city might throw me into a dungeon or murder me the moment I set foot there. I've had enough of Lannisters for a lifetime. Besides, the Ironborn carry a reputation that might sour the talk before it begins. And I'm your wife, the Queen of Salt and Snow. Some might see that as a provocation. Robb considered carefully. Perhaps my mother should go. She has some measure of courtesy with them, though I fear the Lannisters might try to use her as a hostage. Or we send someone like the Blackfish, who won't be easily intimidated but also won't cause a new war by accident. Asha shrugged. Do what you must, but whichever envoy you choose, they should have a retinue that includes some Ironborn, to show we're united. Even a handful might remind the crown that we stand together. I'll select men who won't pick fights at the first insult. He nodded in agreement. Very well. Let's propose that to the council tonight. We can draft a response to Cersei, accept her invitation to parley, but on our terms. Thus, the cycle of political maneuvering continued. That same evening, a council gathered in the great hall that had once served as a Lannister administrative seat. Robb, Asha, Catelyn Stark, who had arrived not long ago with Roose Bolton's forces, Brynden Tully, and a handful of Northern and Ironborn captains discussed the Raven's letter. There were heated opinions. Some insisted that parley with the Lannisters could be a trap. Others argued that refusing to negotiate might push the crown to unify all the southern forces against them. In the end, they settled on sending the Blackfish, Brynden Tully, along with a small entourage of knights from the Riverlands and a contingent of Ironborn carefully chosen by Asha. They would ride to King's Landing under a white flag, escorted by enough cavalry to discourage easy treachery. If the Lannisters agreed to an official summit, then conditions would be hammered out. If the talks broke down, at least they would gather intelligence. Catelyn was uneasy. She pulled her son aside after the council in a dim corridor lit by torches. "You know they have Sansa still," she whispered, voice taut. "I have no word of Arya. For all I know, they hold her too, though no one admits it. If you open the door to negotiations, you must use it to demand your sister's release. They are Starks. They belong with us." A pang clutched Robb's heart. He never forgot Sansa or Arya, but the demands of war had overshadowed his anguish. "Of course, Mother. The crown claims they'll let Sansa marry Joffrey someday, but that's not a comfort. I'll push for her freedom. Perhaps Brynden can glean more information. We will not abandon them." Catelyn's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I know. Your father would do no less." Then she pressed his hand and left him, the echo of her footsteps fading into the corridor. Robb stood there, fighting the hollow ache that came whenever he recalled his sisters trapped far away. He wondered, not for the first time, if the entire realm might revolve around that single pivot, the Lannisters refusing to release the Stark hostages. Peace would remain elusive so long as that was the case. The next day dawned cool and bright, with a sea breeze cutting through the city. Brynden Tully prepared to depart. A small retinue of knights and Ironborn boarded horses in the courtyard. The Ironborn among them were plainly uneasy with the idea of riding, as most would have preferred traveling by ship, but the land route was swifter and safer for an official parley. Robb stood by the main gates, bidding them farewell. The Blackfish clasped his forearm. "I'll do what I can, Your Grace," Brynden said. "But keep your wits. The Lannisters are cunning, and Cersei is the most cunning of them all." "I know," Robb answered. "Bring back any word of Sansa and Arya." Brynden nodded. Then his gaze shifted to Asha, who stood nearby with a pair of Ironborn warriors. She approached, extended a gloved hand to the Blackfish in an almost cordial gesture. "My men are loyal to me," she told him. "If you give them orders, they'll follow, but keep them from trouble if you can. I've chosen men less likely to spit on the Iron Throne's floors." Brynden gave a half-smile. "Understood." He bowed stiffly to Robb. "Wish me luck." They rode out, trailed by the clank of steel and the flutter of banners in the breeze. Soon, the gates of Lannisport swung shut behind them. Robb felt a weight in the air, as though a chapter of fate had just been turned and the next page was blank. With the envoy on its way, the city returned to the daily grind of reconstruction and wary cohabitation. Yet even as Lannisport settled into a semblance of routine, new challenges loomed. Ravens came from the Riverlands. Rumors that Walder Frey was mustering men again, uncertain whether to stand by the king in the north or to break faith. Other messages arrived from the north itself, some from White Harbor, others from the Drefort. The latter were terse, typically from Roose Bolton's kin, referencing possible trouble along the northern coasts where some Ironborn captains had grown bold enough to test the boundaries of the new alliance, raiding not Lannister territory, but lesser northern holdfasts. If that was true, it needed to be stopped at once. Asha bristled when she heard the reports. "They're fools if they think they can raid the north and not face my wrath. The king in the north is my husband. I'll see them drowned if they jeopardize what we've built." Robb appreciated her vehemence. "We need to root out any captains ignoring your authority. We can't tolerate open raids on our own coasts. Have you an idea who might be leading these attacks?" A flicker of frustration crossed her features. "Possibly the Harlaws or the Botleys. They're large clans with many distant cousins commanding longships. Not all are loyal to me personally. My father's hold on them is shaky too. He can proclaim me his successor, but that doesn't mean every Iron captain will obey." Robb considered swiftly. "We can send a small fleet north to patrol the coast. They must carry my personal orders co-signed by you. Let them track these rogue raiders and deal with them. We can't afford to let such men cause havoc." Asha nodded. "Agreed. Let it be done. If they resist, we'll sink them." Thus, detachments were organized. Raven after raven flew, carrying instructions to local lords in the north to be on the lookout for Ironborn not sanctioned by the crown. Meanwhile, a handful of Reaver longships loyal to Asha departed from Lannisport, sailing north to the rocky coasts near Bear Island and the Rills. The plan was to coordinate with the Mormonts or the Dustins to trap any lawless raiders. Robb prayed that would solve the matter without kindling fresh enmities. In the midst of these logistical concerns, the deeper worries about winter and the wall seeped in. Ravens from Castle Black mentioned wildlings gathering in great numbers beyond the wall and rumors of ominous sightings that sounded like the White Walkers of legend. Maester Luwin, back at Winterfell, had passed along these messages, urging caution. The realm might be convulsed by war, but the northernmost border faced a threat older and darker than any Lannister. Robb had not forgotten, though he felt powerless to address it while the war hammered every corner. One dawn, as Robb breakfasted in a small chamber off the courtyard, reading over reports, Asha strode in, boots echoing on the stone floor. He looked up, seeing the tension in her stance. "A rider's come from the camps beyond the city walls," she said. "He claims to bear urgent news from the Dreadfort. He wouldn't speak it to me, said he needed you specifically." Robb rose at once, leaving his half-eaten bread and a cup of watered wine. They crossed the courtyard where the rider waited under watchful eyes. He was a young man in Bolton livery, dusty from the road, face pale with exhaustion or fear. When Robb approached, the man bowed shakily. "My lord, my king, I bring word from Lord Roose Bolton at the Dreadfort. There's been an incident. He requests your presence in the north." Robb's heart lurched. "What sort of incident?" The rider wet his lips, glancing at Asha as if hesitant to speak in front of an Ironborn. Then he straightened. "The rumor is that stray Ironborn ships have attacked multiple villages along the lonely hills, not just for plunder, but they took northern women, children, burned their homes. The bannermen are outraged. If not handled soon, House Bolton fears open revolt among the northerners against the alliance. They cry out for vengeance." Asha cursed softly under her breath. Robb kept his tone calm, but inside, fury and dread roiled. Was it truly Ironborn? Or bandits wearing their banner? The rider nodded grimly. Witnesses saw the Kraken sigils on the sails. The Reavers boasted of their ties to King Balon. We don't know if they acted on Balon's orders, but the result is the same. Northern blood spilled. The lords say you must come home or they will avenge themselves. An acrid taste rose in Robb's throat. He had tried to account for this possibility, but reality cut deeper than any hypothetical. The war had scattered loyalties. Some Ironborn might see the alliance as a betrayal of their own ways or simply as an excuse to strike in the chaos. If the North turned on Robb now, if House Bolton and others decided he had grown too soft with the Ironborn, it could spark a new conflict that might unravel everything. He looked to Asha, who appeared grim. "I'll gather my men. We'll sail or ride north. We can't let this stand." She nodded. "I'll come with you. We'll show them we won't tolerate these outrages, no matter whose flag they claim." Robb considered for a split second, then clasped her hand. "Yes, we go together. We quell this before it grows." He quickly assembled a war council. Catelyn, Great John Umber, and other key figures gathered to hear the news. Some, like the Great John, roared for immediate punishment of the raiders. Others worried that leaving Lannisport might open it to a Lannister reprisal. But they all agreed that ensuring the North's loyalty was paramount. If the North lost faith in their young king, no alliance or city would stand for long. So it was decided. Robb would take a strong contingent of northern troops, those who remained in Lannisport, and a portion of Ironborn, with Asha at his side, and journey north. Catelyn would remain in Lannisport with a skeleton force to maintain order, aided by certain Ironborn captains who pledged to keep the peace. Roose Bolton was already at the Dreadfort, presumably preparing to restore calm by any means necessary. Within 3 days, they departed. The journey north was a test of wills. They could travel by sea and land at White Harbor, then ride inland to the Dreadfort, or they could attempt to ride all the way through the Westerlands and the Neck. Each route had drawbacks. In the end, they chose the sea. Asha commanded a handful of Ironborn ships, plus a Tully vessel or two for the Northern Cavalry. They set sail from Lannisport's harbor on a gray morning, the horizon lined with clouds that threatened storms. The wind was brisk, and Robb felt an almost painful sense of déjà vu. Only months ago, he had taken these waters under completely different circumstances. Asha stood at the prow with him, cloak whipping around her frame. As the city's walls receded behind them, she glanced at him. "Ever think you'd be riding Ironborn ships to your homeland, trying to chase down renegade raiders?" He shook his head. "No. I expected to fight a war with the Iron Islands, not to be allied with them. And now we're on a mission to preserve that alliance by punishing some of your own. It's a strange turn indeed." She pressed her lips together. "We must be swift. If the lords of the North believe you're letting the Ironborn run free, they'll never forgive it. We have to prove that the men who did this are outlaws to us both." Robb nodded, scanning the steel-colored waves. He felt like a man trying to hold back a tide with his bare hands. Enemies lurked everywhere, enemies who might exploit any sign of weakness. The North was proud and resilient, but also slow to forgive. If these raiders had truly burned villages, stolen women, children, the memory of that would linger for a generation. Even the name Greyjoy might be cursed anew. The crossing took longer than Robb liked, battered by rough seas and headwinds. They skirted the coast, passing the Cape of Eagles and salt pans, though they did not make port. The watery horizon offered occasional glimpses of fishing ships, giving them wide berth. At last, the ships neared White Harbor. A brisk, biting wind whipped across the deck, and the sky was a mottled gray. White Harbor loomed ahead, a proud city with pale stone walls, the Wolf's Head banner of House Stark now flying beside the Merman of House Manderley. Once, a Lannister banner had hung there in an attempt to claim dominance, but those days were gone. As they entered the harbor, Robb glimpsed the parapets of the new castle, and beyond them, the wide harbor bustling with local craft. Some ships flew the banner of Manderley, while others flew the Direwolf. The presence of any Kraken banners was a newer phenomenon. Asha's flagship, the Black Wind, arrived at the front of the small fleet. Robb could almost feel the tension from the White Harbor piers. The Manderleys had reason to distrust the Ironborn, and though they recognized Robb as king, old scars from Balon Greyjoy's rebellion did not fade easily. Yet they were received civilly. Ser Marlon Manderley, a cousin to Lord Wyman, greeted Robb on the docks, bowing low. He threw a wary glance at Asha, but said nothing insulting. Behind him stood a contingent of men in House Manderley's colors. The harbor was well guarded, with archers posted atop the walls. Robb recognized that if anything went amiss, violence could erupt. He was grateful that Asha had left behind the more hot-headed reavers in Lannisport, bringing only those who understood the delicate nature of this mission. Ser Marlon escorted them into the new castle's main hall, where Wyman Manderley himself waited, large and formidable in his seat. Lord Wyman rose with noticeable effort. He had grown heavier over the years, but he managed a formal greeting. "Your Grace, we weren't certain you would come so soon. Word only reached us days ago. But we've prepared the castle to welcome you and your retinue. My knights stand ready to escort you further inland, should you wish." Robb bowed in return. "Thank you, Lord Manderley. I regret that our purpose is grim. We come to address these rumored attacks on northern shores by Ironborn raiders." Manderley's eyes flicked to Asha, and for a moment his fleshy face tightened with disapproval. But he had always been a lord of courtesy. "I see. Well, you'll find White Harbor as loyal as ever. I have my suspicions about who might be behind these raids, but I'll leave that to your royal judgment. All we ask is that you show the North that justice remains a Stark tradition." Robb nodded, feeling the full weight of that statement. "We shall. For now, we must ride for the Dreadfort. Lord Bolton has called for us." As they spoke, Asha stood at Robb's left, her posture tall. She inclined her head fractionally at Manderley. "My lord, I have no patience for traitors among my people. Any Ironborn who defy this alliance are my enemies too. I assure you, they will pay." Manderley dipped his head, although skepticism flickered in his eyes. "We shall see, my lady." Thus concluded their arrival at White Harbor. They had little time for pleasantries or the feasts for which Wyman Manderley was famed. Within the day, they'd arranged for a caravan of horses and wagons departing swiftly northward on the King's Road that wound through the damp lowlands and forests. Asha's Ironborn, so unfamiliar with riding, did their best to keep pace, often grumbling about sore thighs. Robb's own bannermen tried not to smirk in front of them, though occasional jokes flew about fish out of water. Tensions simmered, but Asha's firm leadership prevented any serious clashes. The land changed as they traveled deeper into the north. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and thick stands of pines loomed on either side of the road. They passed small villages where the inhabitants stared in wonder or fear at the sight of Ironborn warriors riding with the king in the north. Some peasants spat on the ground, not quite out of range of the cavalry's gaze, while others bowed hastily to Robb. Rumors of the raids had spread, so every Ironborn face was treated with suspicion. They pressed on, the pace relentless. A week into the journey, they spotted the banner of the flayed man in the distance. The Dreadfort. Once, House Bolton was the second most powerful in the north, but with Robb now crowned, Roose Bolton served him, at least officially. The castle's architecture matched its reputation. A grim fortress of pale stone that seemed to brood over the bleak terrain. The flayed man banner drooped under the weight of a gray sky. As they rode up, gates creaked open, revealing a courtyard lined with Bolton guards in distinctive pale armor. Roose Bolton emerged to greet them. He wore a thick cloak against the chill, his pale eyes as expressionless as ever, a polite half-smile on his lips. "Your Grace, welcome to the Dreadfort. We have much to discuss." Robb dismounted, handing the reins to a stable boy. He took Asha's hand briefly to steady her while she climbed down, then turned to face Bolton. "Yes, we do. We came as soon as we could." Bolton's gaze flicked to Asha. "Lady Greyjoy, you honor us with your presence." His tone was bland, with that soft undercurrent that always made Robb uneasy. "I trust your journey was uneventful." Asha merely inclined her head, saying nothing. The Dreadfort was no friendlier to Ironborn than anywhere else in the north. But the moment demanded courtesy. Bolton led them into the Great Hall, which was less splendid than the halls of the south, but well kept. Torches sputtered along the walls, illuminating hangings that depicted the red flayed man on a pink field. The overall effect was unsettling, as ever, but Bolton himself moved with effortless composure. He wasted no time in calling for a private audience with Robb, Asha, and a handful of other key Northmen. Once they settled around a long wooden table, Bolton laid out the situation. The raids began 2 moons ago, perhaps more. Small fishing hamlets, mostly. The men who do this fly the Kraken banner and speak of Balon Greyjoy's name. They seize captives, burn the rest, then retreat to sea. Our outriders have found beached longboats, but no sign of these raiders afterward. The local lords clamor for vengeance. They question your judgment, your grace, in allying with the Ironborn. A cold sense of dread spread through Robb's chest. How many villages? 6 that we know of, and rumors of more. They haven't ventured too far inland. They strike along the coast near the Blazewater Bay, the Bight, even as far as the area west of White Harbor. The small folk fear to live near the shore. Those who survive speak of men with axes, wearing scaled armor, chanting Ironborn war cries. Asha's face was stone. "Are you certain they're not men trying to shift blame to the Iron Islands?" Bolton's mouth curled in a thin smile. "We found a few corpses of raiders. Salt in their hair, bits of driftwood in their gear. None of the local bandits here would pose so convincingly as Ironborn. It appears genuine." Robb could feel eyes on him from every corner of the table. The northern lords, Serwyn, Ines Frey's lesser cousins who had fled to the north, and others looking to see if he would defend these atrocities or condemn them. The alliance was his creation. The king in the north had wed the Ironborn princess, bridging the unthinkable. He clenched his jaw, turning to Asha. "We can't let them continue. Tell me, do you have an idea who might lead them?" She inhaled slowly. "There are a few captains who might be brazen enough. Dagon Harlaw, Dagmar Cleftjaw, Ralph the Limper. They once followed my father. I doubt they recognized my authority when I joined you. They might see it as a betrayal of the old ways. If so, they'll carve out their own path with blood." Bolton watched her, expression unreadable. "If these men are indeed acting without your father's leave, that suggests the Iron Islands themselves are not unified." Asha gave him a razor-sharp glance. "We are as unified as your north. Are you all mindless thralls who do exactly as your king commands? I see you harbor traitors, too. The Freys are half traitors by blood, are they not? Don't lecture me on unification." Bolton's faint smile returned. "I merely observed, my lady." "No offense." Robb intervened, raising a hand. "We're not here to trade insults. We're here to solve this. We must gather a combined force and flush out these raiders. They must learn that if they defy our alliance, they face the wrath of both the North and the Iron Islands. Lord Bolton, can you assemble men for a coastal campaign?" Bolton inclined his head. "Easily enough. The local lords will muster as well. We can ride down to the coast and attempt to corner them on land. They hide in coves, so we'll need ships to cut off their escape." Asha nodded. "We'll call in the loyal captains from our allied fleet. Send word to any Ironborn moored at White Harbor or near Deepwood Mott. If we coordinate, they won't slip away so easily. But I'll warn you, the north has many coves and hidden inlets. This could be a protracted pursuit." Robb's mind churned, recalling the land's geography. Better a protracted pursuit than letting them terrorize the coastline. If we show the small folk that we're defending them, we might repair some of the damage done to our alliance's reputation. So be it. We'll muster at once. Thus, within days, a new host began to form at the Dreadfort, a mix of Bolton levies, Serwyn men, other small northern houses, plus the handful of Ironborn who had come with Asha. The plan was to march to the coastal regions east of the Dread Fort, near a scattering of fishing villages that had been struck recently. Meanwhile, ravens flew to White Harbor, instructing any loyal Ironborn ships to sail out and patrol the waters. If the raiders tried to escape by sea, they would hopefully be caught. Word was also sent to Deepwood Motte, requesting Glover men to join the effort. All understood the urgency. If the raids continued much longer, the North might revolt against King Robb's entire settlement with the Iron Islands. As they prepared to depart, tensions between the Dreadfort men and the Ironborn were apparent. The Bolton soldiers eyed their newfound allies with the same look they would give a viper in a basket, and the Ironborn responded with scorn. Asha busied herself giving stern orders to her captains, making it clear that any outbreak of violence between them and the northern soldiers would be met with her personal fury. Roose Bolton, in his quiet way, seemed almost pleased by the friction, as if it offered him some advantage. He never raised his voice, but Robb noticed how he observed every conversation from the corner of his eye. Perhaps he was simply biding his time, waiting to see how strong the Wolf and Kraken alliance truly was. At last, the host rode out under a sky that threatened rain. Robb and Asha led at the forefront, flanked by Bolton knights and Ironborn axemen. Over the next several days, they traveled through the damp, forested roads until at last they reached the bleak coastline of the eastern north. The sea stretched out in cold gray emptiness, the shore jagged with rocky beaches. A handful of battered villages lay scattered along the shore, each sporting blackened timbers from burned huts. The survivors eyed the approaching army with a mixture of hope and terror, uncertain whether more men bearing the Kraken banner walked among them. Robb dismounted to inspect one village that had been recently attacked. A salt tang mingled with the charred smell. Broken nets and overturned boats lay rotting on the sand. He knelt by a patch of scorched earth, brushing his fingers over the ashes where a house once stood. A fisherman's widow stepped forward, gaunt with grief, cradling a child against her side. She stared at Robb, then spat at his feet. "You let them come," she hissed in a raw voice. "You brought the Ironborn on us. Why should we trust you to stop them now?" Robb's throat constricted, but he looked her in the eye. "I am sorry," he said, "and I will not allow these men to harm you again. We'll hunt them down and make them pay." She said nothing, only turned away, hugging her child closer. Robb felt the sting of her words long after she vanished into the remains of her hut. He realized that, from her perspective, the difference between loyal Ironborn and rogue Ironborn mattered little. Both flew the Kraken banner, both came from the sea. Asha joined him, gazing around at the wreckage with somber eyes. "They might never forgive us." "Perhaps not," he murmured. "But let's see if we can give them justice." He rose. "We move on." Scouts soon brought word of a cove just north of their position, rumored to be a hidden anchorage for raiders. The host advanced carefully. Robb and Asha led the vanguard, accompanied by a mix of Bolton soldiers and Ironborn who were proven loyal. They crept through a thick stand of pines, the ground sloping down toward a narrow beach. The crashing of waves reverberated through the trees. Fog clung to the coastline, a white haze that obscured their vision. The scouts paused, gesturing silently. Through the shifting mist, Robb glimpsed dark shapes in the bay, longships, 3 or 4, drawn up on the sand. Men moved about them, hauling goods from the boats, some brandishing axes, others pacing with the swagger typical of reavers. The wet hiss of waves against hulls provided a disquieting rhythm. Asha peered from behind a trunk. "They look like Ironborn, all right," she whispered. "I can't see their sigils in this fog, but I'd wager they're our prey. Let's hope we can catch them off guard." Robb signaled to Bolton, who had drifted near them. Bolton nodded once, a half-smile on his pale lips, then disappeared back into the ranks. Moments later, a group of northern archers formed up behind the tree line, arrows nocked. The plan was simple: the archers would loose a volley, sow confusion, then the rest would charge. Meanwhile, the loyal Ironborn would try to flank from the beach, cutting off the raiders' path to the longships. At Robb's command, the archers released. Arrows whistled through the air, dark streaks vanishing into the fog. Shouts erupted from the cove. The forms near the boat scrambled, some dropping their cargo, others ducking for cover behind the hulls. A few arrows thunked into wood, but scattered cries told of hits. Then the roar of the Northmen's charge filled the air. Robb drew his sword, surging forward through the trees, hooves and boots churning the sandy soil as they burst onto the open beach. The raiders responded fiercely, axes and cutlasses gleaming in the gloom. Robb caught a glimpse of a sigil, a black kraken on battered sails. No mistake now. These were Ironborn turned outlaw. He engaged a man in scaled armor who lunged at him with a short spear. Robb parried, twisting aside, then drove his sword through the man's torso. Warm blood spattered the wet sand. An arrow hissed past Robb's ear, burying itself in a driftwood log. The fog made everything feel surreal, shapes emerging and vanishing like phantoms. Asha's voice cut through the chaos as she shouted at the raiders. "Stand down. In the name of Asha Greyjoy and the king in the north, you're outlaws to us all." She fought like a fury, twin axes in hand, turning aside a blow from a thick-bearded reaver who bellowed curses. Another raider lunged at her from behind, only to be shot down by a Bolton archer. The sand became slippery with blood and seaweed, bodies sprawled underfoot. The loyal Ironborn circled around, tangling with the rogues who tried to push off their longships. One boat actually shoved free, men frantically rowing away from the melee, but northern archers riddled them with arrows from the shore. Robb slammed his blade against a reaver's axe, gritting his teeth as the Ironborn roared defiantly. With a grunt, Robb forced the man's weapon aside and delivered a killing stroke. A swirl of fog parted, revealing half a dozen more raiders rallying near a rocky outcrop. Their leader, a tall man with braided hair, pointed a curved sword at Robb. His voice carried over the pounding surf. "So this is the wolf who sold his soul to the sea bitch. You ally with the Iron Islands, do you? You've doomed your own folk, fool boy." Robb recognized the name on that man's lips. He just slurred an insult at Asha. Fury burned. He strode forward, raising his sword. "Your crimes end here. Surrender or die." The raider only laughed harshly. "We are the Ironborn. We bow to no wolf, no traitor queen. We keep the old way alive." Then he charged. Robb met him head-on, steel shrieking. The man's strength was considerable, but Robb's training and fury gave him the edge. He lunged in low, slashing the raider's thigh. The man stumbled, tried to parry, but Robb hammered down with savage speed. He felt the jolt up his arm as his sword sank in. Another cry, a spurt of blood, and the raider leader collapsed onto the slick sand, cursing with his dying breath. Behind Robb, the rest of the outlaws began to falter. They were outnumbered and pinned between the Northmen and their own loyal Ironborn kin. Some tried to run for the sea only to be cut down or forced to surrender. By the time the fog began to lift, the beach was littered with bodies. The surviving raiders, perhaps 15 in all, were rounded up, bound, and guarded by the Bolton men. A few loyal Ironborn glowered at their kinsmen in disbelief or disgust. Robb surveyed the wreckage, heart pounding, chest heaving with exertion. They had won this skirmish, at least. Asha approached, wiping blood from her cheek. "We got most of them, I think. If others escaped, they won't get far without ships. We sank or captured all but one boat." She glanced at the wounded and the dead. "It's a start." Robb nodded grimly, turning to the prisoners who knelt in the sand, hands tied. Some glared defiantly, others stared down in defeat. One spat at Asha's feet and sneered, "You're no daughter of Balan, Greyjoy. You're just a wolf's whore." She stiffened, eyes burning cold. Robb saw her reach for a dagger at her belt, but she paused. Instead, she spoke calmly, "You'd best guard that tongue. I might decide to cut it out." Roose Bolton stepped forward, his voice that eerie quiet. "Your Grace, Lady Greyjoy, the law is clear. These are criminals, guilty of murder and rape. How do you wish to proceed?" Robb's gaze swept over them. Their crimes were abhorrent, but he knew that how he handled this would set a precedent. Execute them, and some Ironborn might call it betrayal, though Asha seemed ready for that. Spare them, and the North would rage at him for weakness. He felt a chill wind pass over the beach. "We judge them here," he said at last. "In the name of the North and the Iron Islands both. They are outlaws to each. I'll hear their confessions, if any, then pass sentence." The men stared at him with murderous hate. One raider moaned, clutching a leg wound. Another spat curses. None seemed interested in pleading for mercy. Robb steeled his heart. He turned to Asha, brow raised. She nodded once, solemn. "So be it." One by one, the outlaws were brought forward. In each case, the charges were read out: the burning of villages, the taking of captives, the murder of small folk. The men either snarled denial or swore that they followed the old ways. Robb listened, mindful of the Watchers, Northmen who expected swift, brutal justice, and Asha's Ironborn who needed to see that these traitors were being punished as criminals, not as scapegoats. Ultimately, none of these raiders showed remorse. They claimed loyalty to the Iron Islands, but not to Asha, not to Balan's attempt at kingship under any treaty. Robb unsheathed his sword once more. He recited the words his father had taught him, "In the name of the king in the north, I sentence you to die. May the gods, old or drowned, have mercy on your souls." Then, with solemn precision, he dealt the headsman's stroke. Asha stood close, silent as each blow fell, a dark fury in her eyes. Bolton's men watched with cool detachment, though some seemed to relish the sight of Ironborn being put down. The heads were collected, laid aside on the damp shore. Gulls circled overhead, crying in eerie lament. When it was done, Robb lowered his sword. Blood streaked the blade. He recalled how his father had always insisted on administering justice personally. That was the old northern way, the one who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Only now, the sword was swung for a cause that defied all past tradition and alliance with the Iron Islands, forging a realm no one had imagined. Asha breathed a harsh sigh, meeting Robb's gaze. "I suppose that was the only way." "It was," he said. "We'll do the same for any others we find." Bolton approached, offering a slight bow. "This should appease the local lords, Your Grace. The men who lost their homes might find a measure of relief in seeing these criminals dead." He surveyed the carnage. "If I may suggest, we could mount their heads along the coastline, as a warning to any who would attempt further raids." Asha grimaced but did not object. Robb hesitated, remembering his father's distaste for the display of severed heads. Yet fear was a language these renegades might understand. At length he nodded. "Very well for these. Let it be done." The remainder of the day was spent searching the cove for stolen goods or captives. They found only a few half-starved small folk locked in a makeshift pen, likely intended for sale or ransom. Freed, these prisoners stumbled into the arms of the northern soldiers, weeping with relief. The soldiers glared at the dead raiders, muttering curses. Some spat on the corpses. Others cast approving looks at Robb, evidently reassured that their king had done what was needed. After burying the dead or burning them as conditions allowed, the host returned to the nearest fishing village, bringing the rescued captives along. The villagers, shaken but grateful, provided what scant shelter they could for the night. Thunder rumbled off the coast, but the storm never fully broke. Instead, a persistent drizzle settled in, drenching tents and cloak hoods, turning the ground to mud. Robb, exhausted, found himself in a cramped hut with a leaky roof, the drips falling intermittently into a bucket. A small candle flickered, lighting up the rough wooden walls. Asha sat on a stool, removing her boots. Blood stained the hem of her tunic, though not her own. Her face was set in grim lines. "The longer this goes, the more I see how precarious it all is," she murmured. "It's one thing to hold a city like Lannisport, but out here, in these corners of the realm, old hatreds run deep. One spark, and it becomes a forest fire." Robb pulled off his sodden cloak, tossing it aside. The weariness in his bones felt immense, as though he'd aged a decade since crowning himself king in the north. "We can only keep stamping out those sparks until something like peace takes hold, or until one side breaks the other entirely. But I won't let the north turn on you, just as I won't let the Ironborn betray the alliance." She gave a low, humorless laugh. "I appreciate the sentiment, Wolf, but we both know how easily men can be swayed by blood feuds. Maybe we'll spend our whole lives fighting to hold the center together." He sank onto a bench, elbows on his knees, letting out a long breath. "If that's what it takes, then we do it. For the North, for the Iron Islands, for the future we've paid for in blood." She studied him, her dark eyes reflecting the candle flame. "You truly believe in it, don't you? That we can craft something better than what we had?" "I have to," Robb said. "Else my father's death, my men's sacrifices, everything we've done, would it just be a cycle of vengeance? No, there must be a purpose." A faint spark of warmth lit her features, then she stood, crossing to where Robb sat. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "And I'll stand with you in that purpose, so long as you show the strength to see it through. The day you falter, the Ironborn will slip through your fingers." "I understand," he said, meeting her gaze. "You won't find me faltering." She nodded, and for a moment they stayed like that in the flickering darkness, a quiet communion of two warriors bound by necessity and, perhaps, by something that grew in shared adversity. Outside, the rain pattered softly on the roof and a distant rumble of thunder reminded them that storms were never far away in this realm. At dawn, they broke camp. Over the next weeks, Robb and Asha led the host up and down the coastline, tracking rumors of other raider bands. A few they found and routed in pitched skirmishes. Others eluded them, slipping to sea before the combined force arrived. Slowly, word spread that the king in the north and the Iron Queen were hunting down all who defied the new order. Heads on pikes along the shore served as grim testimony. The northern lords observed, sometimes grudgingly, that Robb was willing to spill Iron-born blood to protect the north, which eased their fury somewhat. But hatred did not vanish overnight. Many still whispered that the Iron-born were untrustworthy. Asha's presence, though valued by Robb, remained a constant reminder of the old wounds between their peoples. Even so, victories piled up and the attacks diminished. Refugees trickled back to rebuild huts along the coast. The alliance had proven it would stand, at least for now. As the coastal campaign wound down, word came from White Harbor that Brynden Tully's envoy had returned from King's Landing. The Blackfish was on his way north, bearing news of the negotiations with Cersei and Joffrey. Robb and Asha agreed they should meet him at White Harbor. Any new treaty or threat from the crown would be crucial to the shape of the realm. So they parted ways with Roose Bolton, leaving him in charge of securing the coastline. Bolton gave Robb a courteous send-off, though his mild expression betrayed little of what he truly felt. Robb kept a wary eye on him, remembering that Bolton was never fully predictable. The ride back to White Harbor took them through damp forests and across the serpentine White Knife River. By the time they arrived, the days had grown shorter, a harbinger of the next winter pressing on the north. The nights were chilly enough that their breath steamed. They found the city in a state of bustling readiness, merchants hawking wares under banners of House Manderly and House Stark. The harbor, they soon discovered, was thick with ships from the Riverlands, and even from Lannisport, trade was springing back faster than expected. At the new castle, Brynden Tully awaited them in a private hall, flanked by the half-dozen knights and Iron-born from his envoy. They all looked travel-worn, but glad to see Robb. The Blackfish bowed sharply to his king, a respectful greeting tinged with familial warmth. "Your Grace, Lady Asha. I bring tidings from King's Landing." Robb motioned for him to rise. "We're eager to hear. Is the crown preparing a new assault, or do they still desire peace?" Brynden ran a hand through his graying hair. "A complex matter as ever. Cersei projects confidence, but I sense fear beneath it. The Tyrells remain in uneasy alliance with the crown, but they haven't fully committed their fleet to an invasion of Lannisport. Perhaps your victory in the west proved too costly for them to risk open war. On the other hand, they might simply be biding their time." Robb let out a breath. "And Joffrey? What of him?" The Blackfish's lip curled. Still a petulant boy-king, though older now and more vicious by rumor. He scarcely attended the negotiations, letting his mother handle the details. "The gist is that they have not renounced the truce, but they demand certain concessions if we expect them to leave us in peace. Chief among them, the crown refuses to accept the full independence of the Iron Islands. They speak of your vow to hold them in check and how these Iron-born reavers still roam the seas." Asha's mouth tightened. "They likely heard about the raids in the north and want to use them against us." Brynden nodded. "Precisely. They claim your alliance is not enforcing discipline, so they have reason to treat the Ironborn as pirates. They also refuse to release Sansa until they have guarantees. They want hostages from your side as a gesture of good faith." Robb's fury flashed. "They already hold my sister hostage. Now they want more." The Blackfish spread his hands. "I told them it was unacceptable. Still, they insisted that a stable peace requires mutual promises. And, in truth, they fear that the Ironborn might raid the Reach or the Crownlands at any moment." Asha let out a derisive snort. "We might, if they provoke us." Brynden sighed. "I reminded them that your alliance sacked Lannisport only after Tywin waged open war. They remain unconvinced. As for the name Targaryen, rumors swirl that Daenerys Stormborn is alive overseas with dragons. Cersei is uneasy about any alliance that might threaten the crown from multiple fronts. The Queen is balancing too many knives, so to speak, and wants to keep you from aligning with the rumored Targaryen in Essos." Robb mulled the news, pacing. "Then King's Landing is not preparing an immediate invasion, but they hold Sansa as a bargaining chip. They want either the Iron Islands leashed or some northern hostages in exchange for releasing her, possibly." The Blackfish nodded. "Yes. And they also made mention of Arya, though they denied having her. They said she vanished after your father's death. They made no guarantee of her safety or location." Robb's heart ached. "Arya? Where was she?" He remembered the fearless girl who'd used a wooden sword to chase cats around Winterfell's halls. Now she was a phantom missing in the chaos of war. He forced himself to focus on the immediate crisis. Asha eyed Robb. Do we even entertain giving them hostages? The notion churns my stomach. The Ironborn never do that. We stand or fall by the sword. Catelyn Stark, who had entered quietly, spoke from the edge of the room. Your father, Ned, was once a hostage in the south during Robert's rebellion. He survived it, returned to the north. Sometimes hostages secure peace, as unpalatable as it is. Robb rubbed a hand over his face. I cannot see a path where I send more of my kin into Lannister hands. That would weaken us immeasurably. They could kill them at will, but I cannot abandon Sansa to their mercy. Brynden said softly, negotiation might pry her free, but they'll demand a heavy price. Perhaps they'll want the Ironborn kept out of certain waters. Or a portion of the gold from Lannisport's trade. Or the head of some key captain. Cersei is skilled at making demands that sow discord between allies. A hush settled as they pondered. Asha's jaw worked in frustration. If we appear divided, she wins. We can't let her wedge the Iron Islands and the North apart. Not while we hold Lannisport. If we yield to half their demands, next they'll want more. Robb stared at the table's rough-hewn surface, recalling how many times he'd felt the weight of impossible decisions. At length he spoke. We send word that we'll consider new terms for a stable peace, but no more hostages. Let them set a price that doesn't involve that. If they persist, we hint that we might reach across the sea to Daenerys Targaryen if indeed she has dragons. The Lannisters fear dragons more than they fear us. That might give them pause. Brendan's eyes narrowed. A bold bluff or half a bluff? We know little about this Daenerys, but rumors say she grows in power in Essos. Catelyn pressed her lips together. That is a dangerous game, Robb. If the crown believes you might ally with a Targaryen claimant, it could provoke them to launch a preemptive strike. But perhaps it is also the only card that truly unsettles them. Robb exhaled. We have few good choices. Sansa's life hangs in the balance. So do the fortunes of the North and the Iron Islands. We'll have to be careful with how we phrase everything. The one advantage we have is that the crown is wary of full-scale war after losing Tywin in the West. In the days that followed, they drafted a careful reply which Brynden and his men would deliver. Meanwhile, White Harbor bustled with the combined presence of Northern foot soldiers and Ironborn sailors. Asha and Robb tried to keep tensions low, but old grievances lingered. Even so, Manderley continued to maintain a neutral courtesy, hosting small feasts that were overshadowed by the gloom of looming conflicts. Rumors flew that Stannis Baratheon was also active in the Stormlands, pressing his own claim. The realm was still fracturing, even if the worst battles of the War of the Five Kings had passed. In stolen moments of quiet, Robb and Asha would walk along White Harbor's piers at dusk, the sky painted in shades of violet and orange. Merman statues guarded the harbor mouth and the water reflected the city's pale walls. Those moments allowed them to speak candidly, away from prying ears. They spoke of the future, of whether they might see a day without war. Sometimes Asha mused about what might happen if her father died. Would she inherit the Seastone chair? Would the Iron Islands follow her wholeheartedly, or would they splinter into more factions? Robb, for his part, wondered if he would ever truly govern the North in peace, or if he would spend his life playing cat and mouse with Lannister or Tyrell armies. Despite the uncertainty, they found a thread of mutual resolve that bound them closer. They had faced the storms together, led men into battle, spilled blood in the name of forging something new. Now, in the hush of White Harbor's twilight, the salt smell and the faint cry of gulls provided a momentary lull. Sometimes Asha would lay her head against Robb's shoulder and they would watch the darkening sky without speaking. Other times, they shared a hard laugh over the irony of their situation, how a scion of Winterfell and a daughter of Pike had become co-rulers on the western coast. One evening, as they strolled back toward the castle, a child ran up from the shadows holding out a small wooden wolf carved from driftwood. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, barefoot, his clothes ragged. He looked from Robb to Asha. Are you really the Wolf King? He asked in a voice trembling with a mix of fear and awe. Robb kneeled. I am Robb Stark. The child's gaze flitted to Asha. And you're the Kraken Lady? Asha smiled wryly. That's one name for me. I'm Asha Greyjoy. The child extended the carving. I made this. To give to you. My mother said you were fighting men who burned her village. She said you might keep us safe. Robb felt a pang in his chest. He took the little wolf figure, its whittled edges rough. Thank you, he said softly. We will do our best. The boy darted off, disappearing between buildings. Robb and Asha stood there for a moment, the wooden wolf in his hand, raw emotion coursing through them. So many believed or hoped that their alliance might save the North from further devastation. And yet so many forces from King's Landing to Balon Greyjoy's rebellious captains threatened to tear it apart. Robb slipped the wolf carving inside his cloak. Then he and Asha continued on side by side. The fires of countless forges glimmered in the city's windows, blacksmiths pounding steel late into the night to arm Northmen and Ironborn alike. Overhead, the moon rose, casting a ghostly sheen on the harbor waters. Each step reminded them that the calm was never guaranteed, that winter's shadows loomed, that the Game of Thrones in King's Landing continued. But for that night, at least, they walked as partners, husband and wife, forging a fragile unity that might, if the gods allowed, outlast the storms to come. When word at last arrived that Brynden Tully had delivered the next set of demands and conditions to Cersei, the realm seemed to hold its breath. Ravens flitted back and forth, carrying cryptic messages about the Crown's continuing negotiations with the Tyrells, about Stannis' rumored presence on Dragonstone, about new sightings of dire wolves in the northmost forests. The roil of politics never ceased. But in White Harbor, the wolf and the kraken waited, sustaining the newly minted kingdom that the rest of Westeros still struggled to comprehend. Days turned to weeks. Snow began to drift in from the north, the earliest flurries of what promised to be a long winter. The port's waters grew choppy and sometimes sheets of ice formed near the docks at dawn. Robb oversaw the relocation of some troops back toward Winterfell, determined that the castle should not stand empty when the cold deepened. Asha arranged for a rotation of Ironborn ships along the coast, ensuring no renegade captains reignited trouble. They worked in concert, each day forging a deeper bond. Some nights they clashed over strategy, Asha's blunt confidence meeting Robb's measured caution, but found common ground. Their cause demanded it. At long last, a raven arrived from King's Landing bearing news that the Crown was willing to discuss a formal treaty. But the terms included a demand for restitution from the Iron Islands, an official condemnation of the raids, and an assertion that Sansa Stark's release would only come once hostages or gold were exchanged. There was also a new element. The mention of a proposed betrothal between a younger Lannister cousin and someone of the North to seal the truce, a notion that made many of Robb's lords bristle. Clearly, Cersei was testing how far the king in the north would bend. Robb read the message in silence, surrounded by his advisors. Then he closed his eyes, exhaling. The path ahead was as tangled as ever. Could they endure another war if negotiation failed? Possibly. But Sansa's life. Asha stood near him, scanning the letter. They keep prodding, seeing if we'll break. They might eventually relent on the hostage issue, but not without some concession. The question is, do we yield enough to free your sister, or risk her life by refusing? Robb's voice was quiet, but the tension in it was clear. My father would never trade an innocent girl's life for political gain. But we're at war. If I yield too much, the North will call me a weak king. From the corner, Great John Umber, newly arrived from the coastal campaigns, boomed his perspective. I say we threaten to drag the Lannisters from their castle if they harm a single hair on Lady Sansa's head. We hold Lannisport. The Lannisters can't dare kill her. Asha shook her head. They can and they will, if cornered. Joffrey has proven he's capable of cruelty. The only reason she's alive is because they still see her as leverage. Catelyn, leaning against a mantle, spoke in a tremulous voice. I fear for her daily. But we must weigh every step. I know it tears at you, Robb. If only we had a sure path to rescue her without giving the Lannisters more power. Robb gazed into the hearth fire, the dancing flames reflecting the turmoil in his eyes. We'll respond carefully, offering partial concessions. We'll condemn the raids, which we've already done. We'll promise no further expansions of the Ironborn beyond our recognized holdings in Lannisport. But we won't give them hostages from the north. We'll offer gold if we must, though not enough to cripple us. And we'll see how they react. The council agreed, though no one looked entirely satisfied. The realm was battered, winter was creeping in, and a host of external threats loomed. Yet for now, the king in the north and his Ironborn queen stood resolute. A letter would go forth to King's Landing, forging yet another link in the chain of uneasy peace. In the weeks that followed, the first snows accumulated in earnest, blanketing White Harbor's rooftops and drifting along the roads. The Manderley household prepared for the winter feasts, while Robb and Asha weighed whether to remain here or travel to Winterfell before the snows made the journey impassable. Messages arrived from Lannisport confirming that all was stable there, though pockets of Lannister loyalists stirred occasionally. No large host threatened to reclaim the city yet. Riverrun, likewise, was quiet, with Edmure Tully trying to rebuild after the war's ravages. One cold dawn, Robb rose early, stepping out onto a balcony that overlooked the harbor. The sea was gray and still, partially crusted with ice near the docks. Chimney smoke curled into the sky from the city's huts and houses, and in the far distance he saw one of Asha's longships anchored, its black sails furled. He leaned on the stone balustrade, letting the chill wind wake him fully. So much had changed since the day he first marched south to avenge his father. And though peace remained elusive, they had carved out a realm that was no longer subject to the Iron Throne's every whim. The North stood proud, if scarred, and the Iron Islands had gained real standing as an ally instead of a mere rebellious afterthought. He heard a soft footstep behind him. Asha joined him, wrapping a cloak around her shoulders. She wore thick leather gloves, her breath misting in the cold air. She looked out over the harbor as well, then turned her attention to Robb. "You've done what few expected," she said softly. "Broken the Lannisters' hold on the west, forced them to the negotiating table, kept the North more or less united. My father never managed such a thing. Neither did yours or Robert Baratheon after he claimed the throne. Perhaps we're shaping the future, Wolf." He allowed himself a small nod, though his tone was thoughtful. "Every victory we've won came with a cost. Men died, villages burned, hatred festered. I wonder if the next generation will see us as visionaries or butchers." She gave a slight shrug, meeting his eyes. "Maybe both. History never spares the painful truths. But at least we tried to carve a path that defied the old cycles. The realm might not thank us, but we'll know we took the risk." He reached out, clasping her hand. "And we'll keep trying. There's so much left undone: Sansa's captivity, the threat of White Walkers in the far north, the question of whether the crown or the Tyrells or the Freys will cause more bloodshed. But for now, I'm glad to stand here with you, forging something I hope will endure." Her fingers curled around his, firm and warm despite the cold. "Aye, Wolf. There's a long road yet. Let's walk it together." They stood that way for a long, silent moment, gazing at the snow-dusted city, the ice-kissed sea beyond, and the uncertain horizon of a kingdom that needed them both. No banners flapped overhead, no dire wolf, no kraken, but the bond they'd forged roiled with a fierce momentum all its own. They would face the storms yet to come, the cunning plots, the bitter vendettas. And if the gods were just, perhaps, in the fullness of time, they would shepherd their new kingdom through winter's darkness into a dawn of lasting peace. Or perhaps not. In Westeros, fate had a way of sowing tempests when least expected. Yet on that chill morning, with snow gathering on the stones, the Wolf King and the Kraken Queen stood shoulder to shoulder, unyielding and united, determined to prove that their union was more than a desperate gamble. Whatever the future held, be it more war or a fragile peace trembling on the brink, they would greet it as one. The North and the Iron Islands had found their greatest strength in an alliance born of blood and salt. And the echoes of that union, for good or ill, would resound through the seven kingdoms far beyond the breaking of the next dawn.